Honourable members, Deputy Speaker.
Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the member for Ryan. Oh, sorry, member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to convey the extreme frustration of a Kooyong family with the processes of the NDIS. I have to note that I've known this family since they first presented to the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. S is 15. She has spinal muscular atrophy, an incurable and severe neurological condition, diagnosed when she was only 12 months old. Despite receiving state-of-the-art therapy for her SMA, she is still dependent on assisted mobility devices and on intensive supports. From 12 months of age, her therapy has included use of a standing frame. This can get her upright, weight-bearing, moving against gravity. The health implications of not standing for her include joint contractures, osteoporosis, pressure sores, reduced respiratory function and poor circulation. For the first 5 years of her life, she used a loaned frame. Her parents bought her one when she was 6 and she used it for 7 years. When she outgrew it, her parents donated it to another child with the same medical condition. They applied to the NDIS in November 2023 for access to another frame, one which should last her indefinitely because she's pretty much done growing. While waiting, her parents rented a frame. It cost them $7,887. It was demo stock and they had to give it back after 8 months. They have been unable to find another standing frame for her since that time. Since November 2023, my constituents' family have had 12 points of contact with the NDIA. They have spoken to them repeatedly over the phone and by email. They've talked to them about the standing frame, about their application for a conversion of their car so that it's suitable for a wheelchair, and about the rest of their child's plan. Again and again, delays in the NDIS responses have forced changes to this child's plan, to the cost allocation and to the costs of interventions. Those delays have led to a deterioration in S's condition. They have led the family to the point where they have given up and they've just paid for the equipment themselves. They have paid for that equipment at a cost to this family of $21,903. Deputy Speaker, my constituents' family have had to self-fund her medical care because delays in the NDIS system are harming their child. My constituents are well-educated and resourceful people. They are organised and effective advocates. For 10 years they have been battling the NDIS, and they have found its processes frustrating, cumbersome and unresponsive. My constituents have had to pay for their child's equipment because they can, at a stretch, and sacrificing other things for their families, but most families are not in that position. So I ask the government, if this is the experience of an effective, organised, well-resourced family, what is the experience of other people with the NDIS? I hate to think how other families are managing their NDIS experience. And so I place this story before the House. I place it before the Minister, and I place it before the NDIA. And I tell them now, you have to do better.
Member for Solomon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. This Sunday, the 18th of August, is Vietnam Veterans' Day. On this day in 1966, men of the 6th Battalion, supported by New Zealand artillery, encountered the Viet Cong in a rubber plantation outside the village of Long Tan. In the ensuing battle, they were outnumbered 10 to 1. 18 Australians lost their lives and 24 were wounded. It was the single greatest loss of life Australia suffered during the Vietnam War. In the years that followed, they came together to remember their mates lost on that fateful day, and now we gather to commemorate all those who served in Vietnam on that day, and the war still lingers. A veteran wrote to me recently, but what about the other 364 days of the year? Many of us are still hurting every single one of those days. Many of us didn't go of our own volition. We were sent there because of a government edict. And what did we achieve? Everyone completely underestimated the enemy. He goes on. Around 50,000 of us were sent over there, and about 500 came home in body bags. And I wonder how many of us wish we had been in a body bag rather than suffer the mental trauma that has beset us since we came home. And that's on top of the ones with physical injuries. There is a Vietnam Veterans' Day commemoration at Reg Hillier House at Bees Creek in Darwin, or just outside of Darwin in your electorate, Deputy Speaker. It is always a fantastic event. This year also marks the 25th anniversary of the significant events in East Timor, Timor-Leste, in 1999. This September we are commemorating all Australians, military, police and civilians who served in Timor-Leste and the sacrifice of their families. In particular, we remember the 6 Australians who lost their lives serving in Timor-Leste or as a result of that service in Timor-Leste. There will be commemorative services and events held here in Canberra, at the Peacekeepers Memorial, in Dili, in Darwin, in Perth, in Sydney, and unit reunions in Townsville as well. Now, it's on Friday, September 20. Now, why on September the 20th? Well, because this is when the main body of Interfet arrived in Dili 25 years ago. Like the 18th of August for Vietnam veterans, Long Tan Day, now Vietnam Veterans Day, the 20th of September is the date that we commemorate and thank all those who have served in our neighbour Timor-Leste. And we also come together to honour the families of those who served in Timor-Leste. Deputy Speaker, we owe a great deal to our serving men and women and also their families. Coming up this Sunday is an opportunity to remember those who served in the Vietnam War, and it is also 25 years since our service began and continues with Timor-Leste.
Member for Leichhardt.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise today to highlight the substandard of education and well-being of our young students in the Torres Strait region. Takai Secondary College on Thursday Island, Madam Deputy Speaker, is currently in a deplorable state of condition. I personally attended the school during an unannounced, impromptu visit on the 9th of April. Without exaggeration, I can say I've seen third world prisons in better conditions. It's truly shameful that the school has been left to fall into such an appalling state of disrepair. The classrooms are not only outdated, but they are quite literally falling apart. Portions of the ceiling are collapsing, the roofs leak like sieves, and there is black mould so prevalent that it made my eyes burn just after a few minutes. The toilet facilities are atrocious. Several of the cubicles are screwed shut, so kids can't even access them, and the others are without locks altogether. I understand that the Northern Peninsula Area State College in Bamaga is even in worse condition, and I intend to be visiting there next time up in the area to make a similar assessment. After my visit to Tagai, I wrote to the Minister for Indigenous Australians, the Minister for Education, raising significant concerns, inviting them to the school and asking them to intervene and to support the school. Unfortunately, Madam Deputy Speaker, to date I haven't even received a response to those letters. Since then, a 14-year-old student from Tagai Secondary College, Catherine Payton, took the initiative to write to state and federal ministers raising similar concerns and advocating for her school. She even provided her own photos to the ministers. The situation is not acceptable. It is deeply shameful. Neither the students nor the teachers should be subjected to such disgraceful conditions. We need immediate action at all levels, across all levels of government, to get it fixed without delay. This would never be allowed to happen anywhere else in Australia. There would be a total outrage. So why is it acceptable for the only 2 high schools in the Torres Strait region? There's so much rhetoric about closing the gap. So why don't we start with a critical area like safe and appropriate education facilities that will actually drive tangible outcomes? The government was so intent on pushing the voice to the Parliament, but quite frankly what is needed is to listen to Catherine Payton's voice. Visit the school. Tell me that it is in an acceptable condition for Australian students. This is about action, not about slogans. Students should not have to fight for basic educational standards that are taken for granted elsewhere in our country. I hope the government will listen to Catherine and that her voice will become a catalyst for some meaningful change and action in that area. Thank you.
Member for Hasluck.
Congratulations on your ascension to Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure in your first duty today to tell you about an event I hosted on the weekend, and that being the inaugural Hasluck Volunteer Awards, which was attended by over 200 community members. It was an amazing event where we celebrated the wonderful work being done by individuals across the community, so talented and dedicated. Well, the volunteering, as we know, is the lifeblood of all our communities. So it was wonderful and an honour to acknowledge the work of all the fine citizens who were nominated. And our awards covered a few different categories: youth and education, environment, emergency services, sport and community and multicultural. We also presented a Lifetime Achievement Award and the Hasluck Volunteer of the Year Award. Our youth and education winner was Claire Cohen, volunteer speech pathologist. Claire's retired and yet provides a comprehensive literacy report for young people re-engaging in their education at Swan City Youth Service. Our Environment Award winner was Rob Fife, who's given over 20 years of service to the work of Trillion Trees Australia, planting trees across the state. Our Emergency Services winner was Aaron Threadgold, Mount Helena Volunteer Bushfire Brigade Captain, who has served since 2012 in a number of roles and has faced many difficult fires, both local and further afield. Our sports winner was Rakita Ryder from the Kungamar Football Club, a registrar, administrator, canteen manager, first aider, sports trainer. She's served at that club with a single-minded dedication since she was 14 years of age. Our Community and Multicultural winner was Alia Al-Zaidi, Al Noor Community Language Incorporated, president and founder of a school to help children from all backgrounds to learn to read, write and speak in the Arabic language. Our Lifetime Achievement Award went to Paul Crouchley from Mundaring SES Deputy Team Leader, who actually started volunteering with the St John's Ambulance in 1978 and with the SES in 1986. The difficult to determine Hasluck Volunteer of the Year Award went to Michelle Bailey, who's our administrator on the Perth Hills online fire chat. Michelle advises, helps and supports and educates the community throughout the year, but particularly is there during fire season, keeping some 14,000 online chat members informed and ultimately safer. I thank all who came together to make the event such an amazing success. In particular, Tanya Richardson, the Mayor of Swan, Margaret Thomas, the Mayor of Kalamunda, and Paige McNeil, President of Mundaring. I acknowledge also the Honourable Michelle Roberts, the Member for Midland and the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly for her presence, and the Deputy President of Mundaring, Trish Cook, who represented the Member for Swan Hills, Jess Shaw. I thank all the sponsors and donors who made it a particularly joyous occasion, in particular Oak Overgrounds, Bailey Brewing, Pinelli Estate, Mandoon Estate and the Abbey Winery.
Member for Gippsland.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to offer my sincere condolences to the family, the friends, loved ones and work colleagues of Sarah Carter. Sarah tragically passed away last week, aged just 45. Now, Deputy Speaker, I know it's reckless to try and predict the future, but I think all who met Sarah would have assumed she'd go on to achieve much more in her life. She was on such a positive trajectory already. She'd been a long-serving councillor in Maribyrnong, a fierce advocate for the people of the western suburbs of Melbourne. She'd been a mayor on 3 occasions at such a tender age of 45. So she was a classic example, Deputy Speaker, of someone who was taking action locally, but she was also an incredible global citizen. She saw disadvantage and she wanted to be part of the solution and wanted to fix the problem wherever she found it. Deputy Speaker, Sarah had a very strong sense of injustice and was determined to make a difference in the lives of the most vulnerable, the most underprivileged people she met anywhere in the world. She was pivotal in her role with Save the Children in the international engagement that organisation provided, and my thoughts are in particular with her colleagues who were shocked by her loss last week. We first met on a delegation to Cambodia about 10 years ago, and colleagues will well understand that hosting members of parliament on overseas delegations is a bit like herding cats. And at times, when logistics went wrong, despite Sarah's best efforts, it was like watching a blindfolded tightrope walker juggling 4 balls and answering phone calls. And then she always managed to fix the problem somehow and get logistics back on track, dust herself off and return to that picture of serenity until the next crisis hit and she went into fix-it mode again. So we stayed in touch, Deputy Speaker, over a long period of time on issues that we were both interested in, and while she was Labor to her core, Labor at heart, she had a lot of affection for the Nats and regional Australians and battlers, so we had a lot to talk about over the years. Now, as members of parliament, we do get to meet many inspiring people, and sometimes it makes us a bit hard to impress. But I was very impressed with Sarah Carter. She impressed me with her passion, her intelligence, her determination, her resilience. She's been a huge loss to our nation, Deputy Speaker, and a huge loss to the Labor family. So I guess, Deputy Speaker, we will never make sense of why someone like Sarah would leave us so early. And the challenge for us in this place is to make sure she's not forgotten. And I think to take the memory of someone like Sarah and make it an inspiration for us in the roles we do. Now, our job is not always easy. Sometimes the political winds blow the wrong way and we suffer misfortunes ourselves in our political lives and wonder about and question our future in this place itself. But if you need an inspiration, I say to everyone in this place, just think what someone like Sarah Carter would have given for a year in this place, a month, a week, an hour. We all thought that Sarah was destined to join us in this place as a Member of Parliament, and she would have been an extraordinary MP. May she rest in peace.
Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services.
Just want to start by associating all members of this place, particularly Labor MPs, with the wonderful words of the member for Gippsland. Heartfelt words, and you could see that in his disposition just now. I thank him for it, most genuine. I want to use the opportunity this morning to give our shout out to an amazing local Albion Park girl, Jess Hull. Olympic Games history was made yesterday when she became the first ever Australian woman to medal in the 1500 metres. An incredible display of determination and speed. She took home silver, finishing in 3 minutes 52.56 seconds. She was beaten only by the defending champion, Faith Kippian from Kenya, who had to run an Olympic record to take gold. It was the fastest 1500 metres in Olympic history. Hull's silver medal was the 7th track and field medal of the Paris Games, and that's the biggest tally that Australia has had in its history since Melbourne in 1956. And Jess Hull now joins local greats like Sally Pearson and Kathy Freeman as Australia's only track medalists this century. A job of work to be done there, Deputy Speaker. I'm sure there's no one more thrilled about Jess's achievements than her family. Hull's dad has been her coach from the earliest days, and her mum Michelle, her dad Simon and her mum Michelle have always believed in their daughter's ability. After the race, Jess shared this wonderful story about her mum, Michelle, who'd sent a photo of her earlier that morning from her little athletics days. And I remember her in her little athletics days. Her and my daughter used to get around the track at Beaton Park and at Albion Park as they made their way through little A's, and Jess was just 12 in the photo. And the text from her mum read, "Do it for this little girl." And she did. And it was absolutely to the thrill of all Australians who were tuned in the early hours of the morning. Jess is an inspiration to all of us, but particularly for little girls who are coming through little A's at the moment or deciding to take up a sport, an inspiration that whether you get to the Olympics or whether you just get to your regionals, you can do it, and it's good for you, it's good for your health, and good for your community. So from Albion Park Little A's to the podium of the 2024 Paris Olympic Games, Jess, you've done your family and your region proud, and all Australians proud. And to all of the Aussies who competed in the Olympic Games, medal or no medal, we know how much hard work it took to get there, so well done to you from all of us.
Yeah. Member for Loing.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge Bonny Hills local Kai McKenzie. Many of you probably have heard in the news about 23-year-old Kai's horrific experience on the 23rd of June when he was attacked by a 10-foot-long great white shark while surfing at nearby Port Macquarie. Kai was not only able to fight the shark off, but he made it back to shore, but sadly not before his severed leg was lost. And it was nothing short of a miracle that among the passers-by who came to Kai's rescue was a retired police officer walking his dog, whose quick thinking saw him tourniquet Kai's leg with the dog's leash and effectively stemmed the bleeding and saved Kai's life. Now, Kai's demonstrated extraordinary courage and well-being and determination in his recovery, and he's vowing to make his return to the ocean and surfing. A GoFundMe page has been started to raise money to support Kai in his recovery, and so far $173,000 out of the $250,000 target has been raised. I and the rest of the community wish Kai a very speedy recovery and extend our best wishes for the future. I'd also like to congratulate the team at Hawks Nest IGA who have taken out the 2024 IGA National Small Grocery and Perishables Department of the Year Award. It's a really significant achievement for the Hawks Nest IGA team, who beat out competing grocers and supermarkets, large and small, from across the state and country. The Lion electorate has a lot of talented sports people, several who did really well at the 2024 Australian Surf Riding Championships, which were held at North Haven Beach recently. Approximately 300 athletes from far and wide descended on the area to compete across bodyboard, shortboard and para-surfing titles. And of the 300 competitors, 3 Lion locals had great success. I'd like to congratulate Hardy Fletcher, who took out the Under-14s Australian Bodyboard Championship, Archer Toms, who was crowned the Under-16s Bodyboard Champion, and Damien Kelly, who secured a podium finish, placing 3rd in the over 35 shortboard titles. And on another note, I'd like to extend my gratitude to Karen Watkins for her 23 years of unwavering commitment and tireless service to the Manning Valley Neighbourhood Service. Manning Valley Neighbourhood Services provide invaluable and tangible support to our community, and I know that many of the incredible services that they offer and the many of thousands of people it has helped would not be possible without Karen's dedication. Well done again, Karen.
Assistant Minister for Health, Indigenous Health and Aged Care.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and congratulations on your appointment. It's an honour to be here this morning and lovely to see you in that chair. It's wonderful news. I give rise to give my first constituency statement since I had the privilege of being sworn in as Assistant Minister for Indigenous Health. And I'd like to share some of the amazing First Nations leadership and strength that we have in my electorate of Cooper. Now, as parliamentarians, we come across local champions who have seen obvious need and not so obvious need and have acted selflessly for their community. And I'd like to honour two of my local heroes, Uncle Ricky Baldwin and Auntie Muriel Bamblett, both of whom have been formally recognised for their incredible work that they do. Ricky has been honoured as the 2024 Victorian NAIDOC Male Elder of the Year, an incredibly well-earned title. He is a passionate Gunai Kurnai man from Lake Tyers Mission. Growing up, he didn't always have the mentors to guide his way, to instil in him a sense of hope and self-determination. And that is what drives his passion to now mentor young Aboriginal people himself towards their own self-determination, cultural identity and a sustained connection to land and cultural practices. Ricky has many strings to his bow. He is a talented artist creating traditional Aboriginal artefacts. He is a recognised elite athlete and is founder and CEO of Koori Academy Basketball. Uncle Ricky's vision of keeping culture alive is fundamental to the growth and well-being of the young people he works with. Through his connections with the AFL, the National Basketball League, state and local associations, he has demonstrated models for a healthy lifestyle that contribute to closing the gap. I thank Ricky for his tireless work and his advocacy. Another local hero is Auntie Muriel Bamblett, who was awarded the Officer of the Order of Australia, AO, for her distinguished service to the First Nations community in Victoria. And this year she was again honoured with the Member of the Order of Australia, the AM. Auntie Muriel is an elder, a leader who looms large in our community for her work with local Aboriginal children and their families, for self-determination and fostering connection to culture. She is a Yorta Yorta Jaja Warang woman and has been CEO of VACA, the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, since 1999. She's also chairperson of SNAKE, the peak body representing First Nations child and family services nationally. Muriel is noted as a spiritual and intellectual force for change, driven by the desire to give children in out-of-home care a connection to culture. As the member for Cooper and now the Assistant Minister for Indigenous Health, I acknowledge these wonderful people's leadership and the leadership of other First Nations people and organisations. Thank you.
Member for Cowper.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. I've said for a long time now that a participant on the NDIS with the right package and the right service provider, for them it is life-changing. It is truly life-changing. And we have to ensure that the NDIS is there for people in the future. Both sides of the House have recognised that at the moment there are problems with the NDIS, and there's an inquiry being undertaken at the moment. Things like extended assessment wait times, overcharging, travel costs, draining packages well before their 12-month limit. But in the past few weeks, another issue has been brought to my attention, this time from the perspective of the NDIS provider. And I should note, these organisations are not fly-by-nighters. They are organisations who have been in my community for over 2 decades. They're not cowboy individuals. They are there servicing the community properly and changing people's lives. But a result of the recent NDIA annual price review, combined with significant increases in workers' compensation premiums in New South Wales, has seen a 16% increase in the workers' compensation premiums without any further claims from the provider. There's no explanation, Deputy Speaker. And it's leaving some of those service providers in an unsustainable position. Data from the Ability Roundtable reported to the NDIA shows a direct link between state premiums and an organisation's margin. The median provider in New South Wales reported a 4.3% deficit margin. So they're losing money, and much of that is a result of these significant increases in workers' compensation. After the pricing review announcement, the disability peak body, the National Disability Services, or NDIS, surveyed its members or member organisation. Collectively, NDS members operate several thousand services for Australians with all types of disabilities. 1,200 organisations responded to the survey, and of those, 84% of organisations are rethinking their future and 75% are considering stopping some or all of their services. I mean, this is frightening for regional and rural Australia, Deputy Speaker, and I urge the Minister for the NDIS to acknowledge this data and incorporate any impact on New South Wales providers into the NDIA pricing review. Please don't let my people go without those services. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Volunteers are the lifeblood of our community. In my electorate of Burt, there are countless local heroes that give their time and energy to make our community a better, more vibrant place to live. Volunteers don't go out with the goal of gaining money or glory, but instead to do their part to support others, to leave their suburb, state and country better than they found it. Their work, however, should not be taken for granted. That's why every year I run the Burt Volunteer Awards, to give our local heroes the recognition that they deserve and to encourage others to consider volunteering too. This year we had more than 30 people nominated for an award. Each and every one of them would have been a deserved winner for the countless hours that they've spent supporting important causes like local disability services, multicultural groups, sporting clubs and so many more. Congratulations go to the 6 winners of the 2024 Burt Volunteer Awards. For sport, Zara Fear from the Armidale Triathlon Club. For community services, Georgina Barker from the Piara Waters Primary School Parents and Citizens Association. For disability support, Dawn Barker from Good Sammys. For youth, Maysara Muzaffar. For multicultural, Stephanie Wei Yin Chan from the Gosnells Chinese Association. And for the environment, Carol Hughes from the Animal Protection Society of Western Australia. And of course to all the nominees. Your contribution to our community may be away from the limelight, but they should never go unrecognised. Another group that deserves more recognition are our early childhood educators. As a dad with young children, I know too well how much work goes into preparing our kids to have bright futures and how reliant families are on having high quality early childhood education and care. In June, the Prime Minister and the Minister for Early Childhood Education joined me to visit Good Start Mount Nashua in Armidale, just down the road from my electorate office. While there, we heard from educators about the positive difference Labor's policies like paid prac placements will be making, and we saw firsthand the hard work that goes into early childhood education day in, day out, work that educators should be fairly paid for. And that's why I'm so proud of our government's announcement last week that we'll see a 15% pay increase for our early childhood educators while putting a cap on childcare fee increases over the next year. That's a win for workers and it's a win for families, and that's what Labor is all about. And we're not just making sure that local workers earn more, we're also making sure that they keep more of what they earn. And that's why last month delivered tax cuts to all taxpayers in our community, with an average tax cut for the people of Burt of just under $1,500. I'd also like to give a final shout out to our local Olympians, Caitlin Parker, who took home a bronze medal in boxing last Thursday. Congratulations, you've done your community and our country proud.
In accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded, and I call on the clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 1, motion relating to tax reform moved by the member for North Sydney.
Member for North Sydney.
Thank you. I move the motion relating to tax reform in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to move the motion circulated in my name. As someone who both grew up in a family that relied on the income of a small family business and has owned and operated small businesses myself, I know exactly how rewarding and at the same time challenging this environment can be. Now then, as the member for North Sydney, I'm delighted to speak on behalf of the 3rd largest business community in the country And it's for this reason that I move this motion today. For if I cannot speak out against the politicisation of our tax system and the impact this is having on small to medium-sized businesses across our community, who will? At a time when these businesses should be protected and supported by our government systems, they are instead being drowned by red tape and dreading calls from the ATO as the tax office pursues modest debts from small operators, whilst large multinationals continue to report bumper profits with little attention. 2023 was a tough year for our usually resilient small business community, with the Australian Securities and Investments Commission identifying that rising business costs were a key contributing factor to small business annual insolvencies. As we entered 2024, Credit Watch predicted the business failure rate in Australia would increase from 4.4% to almost 6% by the end of the year. At the time, the Council of Small Business Organisations Australia CEO, Luke Arctistrat, warned small businesses would need to prioritise cash flow management as higher costs were undoubtedly set to continue throughout the year, and cost of living pressures would make it difficult for small businesses to pass additional costs on to customers. He also argued it would be critical for banks, business partners and regulators to support small businesses wherever possible. Yet 2 months into the year, my office was inundated with calls from accountants and small business operators who suddenly found themselves under the direct scrutiny of the ATO. Then just last week, as we waited to hear what the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman, Bill Bilson, would suggest our government prioritise to support small to medium-sized businesses, many were dismayed to read that the number of administrators being appointed to struggling businesses had grown at an astonishing rate. Not surprisingly, it was businesses in New South Wales and Victoria who were at the greatest risk of being forced under. But gallingly, the report identified that the ATO is playing an active role and a significant role in driving businesses to the wall as it goes into overdrive collecting debts, particularly from small businesses. While I was not surprised by the finding, I was relieved to see it was finally being identified as an issue. We know small business owners are currently paying themselves less and working longer than average to support their enterprises. And the modest initiatives the government had identified to try and help, like the instant asset write-off and the energy rebate, came far too slowly to make any meaningful difference to them. Yet large multinational businesses, including supermarkets and companies in the mining and energy sectors, seem to get away with modest tax payments relative to their profits, while small businesses face lightning-fast calls from the ATO for payment of small debts and threats of insolvency. Interestingly, the recommendations of the Ombudsman on Thursday included, among other things, an ambitious plan for tax concessions. But disappointingly, while he identified the upside of reform, he stopped short in criticising the way in which tax reform in this country is currently pursued. For what it's worth, I agree with the Ombudsman that better access to government contracts and savings from cheaper payment systems for the sector will be welcomed. But these things will not fundamentally reset an environment that has become dominated by increasingly complex red tape. Last week, then, the Reserve Bank further downgraded its expectations for our economy, reporting it has grown by just 0.9% in 12 months to the end of June. At the same time, a corporate insolvency measure compiled by Insolvency Australia showed many businesses are struggling to deal with the drop-off in economic activity and the increase in overall costs. Businesses in New South Wales account for over half of all insolvency appointments in the last 12 months. And the reporting identified that small and family businesses are being hit particularly hard. While the nation's small business ombudsman warns that without ambitious and targeted reform, we could, as a nation, be sleepwalking into a big corporate economy, we are yet to see this government show any intention to push for far-reaching tax reform. Indeed, if the actions of the ATO are anything to go by, it seems the appetite is simply not there. Deputy Speaker, as someone who fundamentally believes small family businesses are the engine room of our economy, I believe it's time this nation had a government that looked beyond the politicisation of tax policy and supported and incentivised small family businesses whilst ensuring our nation stops relying on income generated off the back of individual workers. Thank you.
Is there a seconder?
I second this motion and reserve the right to speak.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Bennelong.
I'd like to thank the member for North Sydney for bringing this motion to this place and acknowledge her upbringing in a small family business, something we both share. Deputy Speaker, recently my local state member for Epping resigned. You might have heard of him, Dominic Perrottet. In his valedictory, he quoted some advice he received from former Prime Minister Paul Keating. Keating said to him, "Dom, I had to teach my bastards to care about money, and you need to teach your bastards to care about people." And I think as we debate this motion today, Deputy Speaker, that is a particularly apt quote to consider. As Keating has the power of doing, in just one simple phrase, he encapsulated perfectly the balance we must strike in governing, and particularly on tax reform. If we pursue tax reform, we have to care about money, but we also have to care about people. Because taxation is not just pure economics, it's about ensuring fairness, fostering growth, and above all, supporting the people and businesses that support our nation. Australia has a long history of tax reform that has often been driven by necessity and at times by vision. But nearly all reform has always been contested. In the modern era, the Hawke-Keating era stands out. And in the true Labor way, the introduction of the fringe benefits tax, capital gains tax and the dividend imputation system were deliberate steps to ensure that our tax system was fairer, more progressive and more attuned to the realities of a modern economy. Subsequent governments have made their own marks on our tax landscape. The Howard government introduced the GST. Meanwhile, other reforms, such as the Gillard government's mineral resource rents tax and the carbon tax, were unfortunately short-lived, swiftly dismantled and then not replaced by the subsequent governments. How different our country would have been if those important reforms weren't politicised and inevitably repealed. And in just a tick over 2 years, we have moved forward on tax reform. Apart from our significant reforms to the tax code and income tax, we've introduced the implementation of a global and domestic minimum tax rate of 15% for large multinationals, many who are based in my own electorate, that's okay, and changes to the petroleum resource rents tax to ensure offshore LNG companies contribute more sooner. They're good steps, and they're significant. Like good Labor reforms, they are deeply rooted in fairness and equity. Big multinationals should pay their fair share of tax. Our resources sector should contribute more from the profits they make off our national resources, and income tax should contribute less to the national intake than it does at the moment. In every measure I've named from the past and the present, opposition came from nearly every angle. Tax reform remains a political football for the left, the right, and for those in the middle. Deputy Speaker, I give this history because I think it's important to illustrate that tax reform in this country is rarely easy or straightforward. It is always contested. Therefore, by definition, it involves tough decisions, political courage, and often significant and drawn-out debate. Yet the politicisation of tax reform has time and time again hampered our nation's ability to create a stable and effective tax system that serves the long-term interests of our society and economy. When tax reform becomes political football, kicked around for short-term vote harvesting, we all lose. I speak from personal experience when I say navigating the challenges of running a small business is a difficult one. I spent my childhood on the floor of my family business. And before I came to this place, I was juggling that business while also serving as director on a number of boards. My time in the private sector taught me a lot. But if there's one thing that I learnt, it's that certainty matters. Certainty for investors, certainty for directors and sole traders. Because certainty creates growth and uncertainty creates doubt. And the politics of fear and division creates uncertainty. No example more current in this parliament than the uncertainty created around energy policy. And we've had similar uncertainty created around tax reform as well. Delays have real-world impacts and they impact small businesses. It would be nice, Deputy Speaker, from time to time for this parliament to give the electorate some certainty. For our big national challenges of fairness, equality, energy, decarbonisation and, of course, tax reform. I'm sure I join with the member for North Sydney and millions of Australians who yearn for a parliament that from time to time can achieve consensus, not just perpetual conflict.
I call the member for Wentworth.
Deputy Speaker, the tax system, like the legal system, is a fundamental structure that underpins Australia's modern society. It raises the revenue we need to pay for government services, it redistributes national prosperity, and it has the power to promote or stifle investment and activity in our economy. But Australia's tax system is no longer fit for purpose. And while there are many aspects that require reform, the impact that the current system is having on small businesses requires urgent attention. Like the members who've spoken previously, I grew up in small business. I've run a number of small businesses in my time, and this group of people who are driving the economy, who employ 42% of private sector workers, are an incredibly important part of my electorate and our community. But small businesses represent a declining share of Australia's GDP. They currently represent around 33% of economic activity, down from 40% from 2006. And it's getting worse. ASIC data shows that insolvencies have risen by 40% over the last 12 months, and half of those small businesses that have managed to stay afloat have considered closing their doors. This chimes exactly with my experience of being in Wentworth in the last few weeks, going around talking to small businesses specifically, and many of them are questioning whether they should go on. This is a major concern for the Australian economy, as small businesses are also a wellspring of innovation and productivity. Private investment in Australia as a share of GDP is at its lowest level since the early 1990s, with corporates choosing to distribute profits to shareholders rather than reinvest in innovation. And that innovation is what we all need. Now, in my discussions with small businesses, they are asking for three things from our tax system. An ATO who is a partner with them when they hit hard times. They want policy certainty once a government announces a policy, particularly a tax policy, that is followed through. And they want tax reform that builds resilience and innovation in the economy. And frankly, we're not getting either of those. Firstly, let's talk about our central tax agency, the ATO. It's a hindrance rather than a helper. In a recent survey released by ACCI, the ATO was listed as by far the most difficult agency to deal with in terms of meeting compliance requirements for small to medium businesses, with over half of businesses saying the government could be doing a better job, and it should be. But secondly, even when the government is explicitly trying to use the tax system to help small businesses, the politicisation and the back and forth in this place means that the wedging opportunities stop creating that certainty for small businesses. We saw this with the small business instant asset write-off that Labor promised to deliver in last year's budget, but only managed to pass the legislation in the dying days of last financial year. The uncertainty created by the government's inability to pass a core budget measure that was promised to the small business community exacerbated confusion and frustration in the business community. I was hearing stories of small businesses from my community where owners were stuck in limbo, waiting for confirmation that they could upgrade equipment, or worse, assuming that because the government had announced it, that it would go through, and so made investment decisions without realising that it hadn't passed the Houses of Parliament and it was stuck in the Senate. This sort of uncertainty is anathema for what businesses need to be able to make the decisions and the investments that drive the economy, that employ 40% of the private sector workforce, and frankly provide livelihood and opportunities for so many Australians. And it's not just the ATO and it's not just the politicisation of policies here in Parliament. It's also that the government and frankly this Parliament, both this Parliament and previous Parliaments have not addressed the major tax reform that this economy needs and that small businesses needs. Because tax settings are preventing young Australians from getting into the housing market, but also from getting into businesses. When I talk to the business community, there's a plea to say, harmonise things like the payroll tax, make it simpler for us, and they still don't understand, and I don't either. Why is there a tax on employing people in this country? Why is stamp duty holding people back from making efficient economic decisions and proper investment decisions? How can we be driving a tax system that actually rewards innovation and investment rather than holds it back? Now, it's not just the business sector where this matters. This is also in the community sector. This affects young Australians who can't get into the housing market, who don't see the prospect of ever owning their own home. Urgent tax reform is needed, and it's much more comprehensive than either of the major parties have contemplated because of their political wedging. It's time for change.
I'll call the member for Parramatta.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. two previous speakers, the member for Bennelong and the member for Wentworth, have both described the important role that small business plays in our economy, and I associate myself with those remarks. 98% of all businesses in Australia are small businesses, and those businesses employ more than 60% of working Australians and account for 50% of Australia's GDP. The key thing for me, though, is the difference between those two last numbers. They employ more than 60% of Australians, but account for only 50% of GDP. And the reason there's a difference between those two numbers is because of the productivity gap between small businesses and large businesses. Small businesses are about 10 to 15% on average less productive than larger businesses. That means that the value added produced from our small business sector per employee is much lower than the value added produced from our large business sector. And that, to me, Deputy Speaker, speaks to an opportunity. If we can lift the productivity of those small businesses up to the national average, we would make a huge difference to our national productivity challenge. So what are the things that are holding back small business productivity? Well, everybody in this place that regularly meets with small businesses and goes down to visit them in their shops and offices and places of work knows how hard it is to be a small business in Australia. They know the challenge of meeting payroll, the difficulties of managing all of the government regulation associated with employment, compliance, tenancies, occupation. They know the stress that so many small businesses are facing right now at a time when not only are revenues soft, but costs are rising. We talk about the cost of living challenge in Australia. So many families are experiencing rising costs. But the small businesses of Australia are not just feeling those rising costs of inputs and labour and materials and rent. Unfortunately, they're also feeling the other side of that coin, which is falling sales as the economy softens. Small businesses are caught by both blades of the scissor. And that's why, Deputy Speaker, now is such a good time to think about what we can do to help small businesses in Australia. Not just to help them through a very difficult time in our economy, but also to realise that largest of economic opportunities that Australia has, to close the gap between large businesses and small businesses in terms of productivity. Now, for a long time, many of the drivers of productivity in our economy were the exclusive province of large businesses. Think about big ERP systems, big pieces of digital infrastructure that enabled big businesses to be more efficient, to manage their workforces better, to reach customers more easily. But today, many of those digital tools, which were once the exclusive domain of large businesses, are now democratised, available to small businesses. Small businesses can use online platforms to help them manage their payroll, do their accounts, conduct advertising and marketing in low-cost online ways. The fixed cost of becoming a small business has fallen dramatically. And if we think about one of the big opportunities to close that productivity gap and to boost our national productivity, it is surely to support small businesses to take advantage of these digital opportunities, to give them the same efficiency tools that big businesses have had for a long time. And as the previous two speakers have also said, another important thing we need to do is help small businesses through the tax system. Now, in the previous government, there was almost no reform to our tax system over the course of 9 years. No changes to superannuation, no changes to many other areas of economic policy, to microeconomics, to competition policy, to financial services, to climate change. Our economy stood still without being renovated or modernised to keep up with the changes across businesses' experience. And that lack of reform has led us to the productivity cul-de-sac that we're in today, where over the previous decade productivity has declined to near record lows. And for this government, returning productivity, both through small businesses and large businesses, is core to our economic agenda.
The time allotted for this debate has expired. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made an order of the day for the next sitting, and I call the clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 2, motion relating to the Geneva Conventions, moved by the member for Moreton.
Member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I move the motion relating to the Geneva Convention in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper.
Member for Moreton.
One aspect of my job that I hold dear to my heart is being co-chair, along with the member for North Sydney and the member for Cowper, of the Parliamentary Friends of the Australian Red Cross. I've been involved with this group for all of my 17 years in Parliament. It's given me an insight into the crucial work the Red Cross and its volunteers do in our communities and around the world during difficult times. We all recognise the emblem of the Australian Red Cross, the opposite of the Swiss flag, and we see that Red Cross during times of humanitarian need. Australian Red Cross staff and volunteers are always at the front line as emergency situations unfold, such as bushfires, cyclones or flooding here in Australia, then add war and famine and earthquakes overseas and so many other disasters. And they're always there in the aftermath of these disasters to provide food, shelter, support and access to services. In fact, in the 6 months to April 24, there were 10 activations of the Red Cross in Queensland alone. That meant 375 Red Cross personnel across 137 days of continuous activation over 87 different locations. As a Queenslander, I thank them for the work that they do during times of distress and need. It's important to acknowledge that their work does not end when the floodwaters subside or the power comes back on. The Red Cross continues to work to help affected communities get back on their feet. Of course, the Australian Red Cross sits within a wider organisation, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity today, on the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions, to reflect on the role of the wider international Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. The International Committee of the Red Cross was founded in 1863 by a Swiss businessman, Jean-Henri Dunant, as a neutral and impartial organisation to aid those affected by the hardships of war on all sides. Deputy Speaker, there's no more crucial time to stress the absolute urgencies for all countries to uphold the Geneva Conventions. These are the international humanitarian laws that outline, amongst other things, how civilians should be treated during armed conflict. 75 years ago today, the cornerstone instruments of international humanitarian law were signed. It is tragic that the number of armed conflicts occurring right now is higher than ever before. More than 110 conflicts are currently devastating communities and regions around our world. The foundational objectives of the 4 conventions are to protect people who are not or who are no longer participating in an armed conflict and to restrict the means and methods of warfare. The first convention concerns wounded and sick soldiers on land during war. The second convention focuses on wounded, sick and shipwrecked sailors at sea during war. The third convention protects prisoners of war, and the fourth convention concerns civilians, including those in occupied territories. National organisations like the Australian Red Cross work to promote and ensure respect for international humanitarian law. They are the rules that come with being human. Not only do they prepare people to work within zones of armed conflict, they work with the ADF and other organisations to train them on international humanitarian law. And a big shout out to all the ADF legalos who do that great work. Respect and understanding of the principles of the Geneva Conventions lay the foundations for enacting them when conflict breaks out. I pay tribute to the selflessness and courage of those serving humanitarian needs in zones of armed conflict. Many of them bear the emblem of the International Red Cross and the International Red Crescent. Tragically, some of them paid the ultimate price for their work, giving their lives to help those in need. Australia is steadfast in its upholding of international humanitarian law. Last month, the Prime Minister released a joint statement with the Prime Ministers of Canada and New Zealand to urge for a ceasefire in Gaza. The statement described the human suffering there and stressed that, and I quote, "Israel must listen to the concerns of the international community. The protection of civilians is paramount and a requirement under international humanitarian law. The joint statement also said we call for Israel to respond substantively to the International Court of Justice's advisory position. So on this important anniversary, I call for renewed respect for human dignity and compassion, indeed a renewed commitment from all countries to uphold our common humanity. The International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement will be reiterating this call when they meet later this year. We need to narrow the gap between acceptance of international humanitarian law and compliance. This is paramount. The innocent victims ask that of all of us.
Is there a seconder for the motion?
Yes, I second the motion. Thank you, Deputy Chair.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call a member for North Sydney.
Thank you. The world is a dangerous place, not because of those who do evil, but because of those who look on and do nothing. Or so said Albert Einstein. I want to thank the member for Moreton for moving this motion, as I believe he's right. He's right to draw to attention the 75th anniversary of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. He's right in saying these conventions are just as important today as ever. Right to lament that while they are universally accepted, they are not being uniformly respected. Right to ask us to honour and advocate for the work of the Red Cross in assisting victims of armed conflict and for advancing international humanitarian law. And right to ask this House to determine Australia should remain a global leader in the promotion and implementation of the principles of the conventions. Today's anniversary reminds us of the importance of advocating for the humane treatment of any person during an armed conflict. It should also remind us that simply calling for this principle to be upheld is only as useful as the steps we're prepared to take when a nation breaches those principles. And for this reason, I would add one more important point to this motion, that being that this House should call on our government to take tangible and decisive action against those who ignore or breach the conventions. Many would be aware of the Geneva Conventions, which actually originated in the Napoleonic Wars in the mid-19th century. Then, Genevan businessman Henry Dunant witnessed the horrors of a gory battle in the Second War of Italian independence. The atrocities he saw impacted him so greatly that he proposed nations cooperate to create trained volunteer groups to treat those wounded in battle and offer humanitarian assistance. In 1863, a committee that included himself and an early iteration of the Red Cross brought 16 countries together in Geneva to discuss the terms of the wartime humanitarian agreement. The resulting treaty, the First Geneva Convention, was signed by just 12 of those countries. 160 years on then, the principles of the conventions have been revisited on multiple occasions, most frequently following a significant conflict. And on each occasion they've been expanded to extend human compassion and ensure accountability. But the existence of the conventions alone has never been enough to stop evil. It did not stop the Nazis in World War II, even though Germany was a signatory of the conventions in 1929. And in recent months, it has not stopped the atrocities we've seen and continue to see in multiple locations around the world. At this time of great uncertainty, I urge our government to move beyond words and towards action to ensure we play our part in protecting and enforcing the principles of the Geneva Conventions. There are more than 100 armed conflicts currently taking place around the world, and we should all do what we can to ensure the loss of innocent life is minimised and that the conventions are upheld. Because ultimately, compliance with these laws during armed conflict can not only alleviate the suffering of people, but can reduce the human, economic, social and environmental cost of war and help facilitate a return to a sustainable peace. These conventions provide a set of rules that seek to limit the effects on armed conflict and protect people who are not participating in hostilities, including by restricting the means and methods of warfare. Importantly, they recognise the rules should apply equally to all, regardless of race, faith, gender, location or nationality, and that no person or country is ever to be placed above the law. The conventions protect non-military places such as hospitals, schools and religious buildings, whilst also protecting those wounded or captured in battle and those who are not fighting, such as civilians, medical personnel, chaplains and humanitarian workers. Today, then, I'd also like to take this opportunity to honour Zomi Frankum, whose life was taken during an Israeli Defence Force drone strike in Gaza on the 1st of April this year. At the time, we were told this sort of thing happens in war, yet the rules of war contained in our international treaties explicitly exist to protect people like Zomi. In the aftermath of her death, Special Advisor Air Chief Marshal Mark Binskin found that chaos, confusion, fear and a breakdown in the chain of command and communications all contributed to Zomi's death. And we can recognise that those things can be true. But we must also reject the idea that the loss of her life was inevitable, for to do anything less is to turn our backs on the conventions and deny her family accountability. The longevity of instruments like the Geneva Convention is up to us, and the more they are tested, the more intentional we must be in protecting them. As a nation, Australia has a role to play in upholding the principles of international humanitarian law, and this includes continuing to support international bodies like the United Nations, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. We must continue to advocate for organisations like the Red Cross, for ultimately there should be no question of when we uphold international humanitarian, nor for whom. Our commitment to these principles in these organisations must remain firm and enduring.
The member's time has expired, and the question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call a member for Bean.
Deputy Speaker, I'm very pleased to rise to speak on this important motion brought forward by the member for Morden. The 12th of August marks an important anniversary, not just my son's birthday, happy 21st Marcus, but much more importantly, the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. While there have always been rules of war and acceptable conduct in conflict and the treatment of non-combatants, many of these rules arose more from accepted norms than enforceable instruments. These norms did not prevent atrocity, far from it, but they did provide guidance, guardrails for conduct in war. You can look back to antiquity to see examples of this. But Deputy Speaker, the Conventions of 1949 were promulgated in the shadow of one of the most devastating periods in modern history. Just a few short years before, in 1945, one of the bloodiest wars in human history had ended. It was a war which was marked by aggressive territorial expansion, the use of weapons of mass destruction against civilian targets, and one of the most organised and coldly executed genocides the world has ever seen. Vast parts of the world had been devastated, and in 1949, the scars of this war were still visible in many cities. It was the context of this terrible, destructive war that compelled the effort to codify and expand upon the rules, in an effort to ensure that in future conflicts, the crimes of the past could be avoided. Deputy Speaker, this is not a matter confined to history. Indeed, the conventions are not abstract notions of legality and principle. These conventions are the very cornerstone of international humanitarian law. They provide for, in the context of armed conflict, the protection of civilians, those providing aid and assistance, journalists and prisoners of war. In every conflict since their promulgation in 1949, these conventions have been tested and sometimes broken. This is despite the universal acceptance of the conventions as a bulwark of international humanitarian law. It's important to remember that every state has ratified these conventions and essentially accepted them as rules of war. It is timely that the member for Morden has brought this motion before us today, Deputy Speaker. Today there are more than 110 conflicts taking place across the world. These range from wars between states to internal conflicts to wars between state and non-state actors. Many of these conflicts are utterly brutal, and the years 2021 to today have seen unacceptably high levels of casualties. In all these conflicts, we've seen the spirit and even the letter of the law of the Geneva Conventions tested and broken. This, Deputy Speaker, is completely unacceptable, and we need to call attention to it. Rules and norms only continue to be effective if they are accepted and enforced. If we fail to call out breaches of the Geneva Convention and pursue those guilty of breaches, then we are contributing to the ultimate undermining of these important principles. Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to recognise the important role played by the humanitarian aid workers who render important assistance in conflicts. In particular, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement have, over a long period of time, provided aid in conditions of great danger. This provision of aid is essential to assisting the many people affected by war, including displaced civilians and prisoners of war. In particular, by providing aid and assistance to these groups in these conditions, these organisations are an important check on violations of the Convention. I pay tribute to their work and efforts. It's essential that humanitarian aid workers be allowed to continue to do their important work in conflict zones, free from threats and interference from any combatants. Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, I imagine the delegates who drafted the 1949 Geneva Conventions were hoping that their efforts would lead to a more peaceful era. While we thankfully have not seen another global conflict on the scale of the Second World War, we have not seen a decrease or decline in the incidence of war around the world. War is still brutal, and with new technologies and equipment, war is increasingly complex. It is in this context that we must all redouble our efforts to protect and enhance the Geneva Conventions and the principles for which they stand. Australia is a middle power and global leader in the promotion and implementation of the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols, must continue to be just that, a global leader in international humanitarian law. Let us all recommit ourselves to this important cause.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Riverina.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today, 12 August 2024, marks the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Following the tragedy, atrocities of World War II, it was clear to the peace-loving international community that a global set of minimum standards had to be implemented to ensure such atrocities were never committed again. And as the member for Bean has just quite correctly pointed out, we haven't seen a war on that scale since. But what we are seeing at the moment is beyond belief, and it is just so sad. We live in troubled times. I do commend the member for Moreton for bringing this motion to the House, but I guess it doesn't really matter so much what we say in this chamber today. It is out there in the halls of power in certain countries that action has to be taken. And what we are seeing in Ukraine is just so despicable. Russia stands condemned for what it is doing. And in the Middle East, of course, there are just innocent people dying every day because of the conflict there. Today, the conventions from Geneva are ratified by 196 states, including all United Nations member states. It cannot be understated just how significant an accomplishment it is to have the world unite and to strive to protect the innocence of war. And that's why this motion is important, but more than that, the world must stand as one, or at least peace-loving communities and countries in the world must stand as one when they see the sorts of actions taken by Russia and taken on October 7 by Hamas. And too many people stand silent when those sorts of outrages happen. And the standard we walk past is the standard we accept, and that goes in local communities. It also goes to the halls of power in the various jurisdictions across the world. Sick and wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, civilians, medical personnel, chaplains and humanitarians all receive the benefit of protection under the conventions, and that is right, that is proper. Unfortunately, it seems war is a reality of life, and it should not be so. It's something which has plagued civilisations for millennia. Even today, despite all of the progress in the field of diplomacy and democracy, our ever-growing friendship and tolerance amongst nations, we see we have not shaken this scourge. People could learn a lot from what took place at Cowra following the 5 August 1944 outbreak. Japanese POWs broke out of an internment camp, 1,104 of them. 234 of them were killed during that outbreak. 4 Australians, 5 if you count the one who died a little later on at Blaney, sadly. But what you saw from that Cowra community is a lesson for the world, and I was pleased that the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese visited for the commemorations weekend before last. And it was interesting that at the press conference where we stood together as Labor and Coalition, as one. One of the first few questions from the journalist was, don't you find it odd that people of a political divide are standing together? Well, no, we didn't, and you know, I think the things that unite us as members of Parliament are far greater than those which divide us. And Cowra reached its hand of friendship to Japan, and it would have been easy at the time to spurn Japan, because it was a situation where there were some terrible atrocities committed against Australian soldiers at Sandakan, at Hellfire Pass and other places by Japanese soldiers, by the Imperial Japanese forces against Australians. And yet
Cowra reached its hand to friendship, and it is now an example to the world of what could and should be done in this instance. And so I commend the member for Moreton for bringing this forward. It is important that we talk about it, but it's more important that we act when we see things that are wrong. When nations of the world see incursions into other countries and the world sees that it is wrong, the world should say so. Not stand silent, because to stand silent is to allow it to happen, to encourage others to do the same. And what we're seeing by Russia and by Hamas-led Palestine at the moment is beyond belief, and it needs to end.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Robertson.
And I would also too like to commend the member for Moreton for bringing forth this incredibly important motion, and also to echo the sentiments that were just put forward by the member for Riverina. There is a lot more that unites us in this chamber than what divides us, and this is exactly what one of those things is: international law and the Geneva Conventions. Now, the number of armed conflicts right across the globe is at an all-time high. We know that the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia has shaken the world, and also that region. Many other armed conflicts across the globe. More than 110 conflicts are currently happening worldwide, with 2021 to 2023 being some of the deadliest years on record for our planet. There is not a more important time now to acknowledge the incredible importance of international humanitarian law, and also known as the laws of war. And 75 years ago, on the 12th of August 1949, the cornerstone instruments of international humanitarian law were signed. The 4 Geneva Conventions set out protections for civilians, they set out protections for humanitarians, journalists, prisoners of war, and those that are outside the fight, those that are outside the battlefield. And they were agreed by countries right across this world, and they remain a beacon of humanity in these troubling times. And what they do is they set out the world's agreement that wars have limits. They set out how, regardless of the circumstances, respect for human dignity and respect for human compassion must always guide the actions of parties to armed conflict. Civilians must be protected. Humanitarian relief must be provided, and those who provide humanitarian and medical services must be protected. Now, we introduced this motion at a critical time when the unacceptable cost of armed conflict demands a renewed commitment to our common humanity. We used the opportunity of this important anniversary to reiterate Australia's commitment to promote the protective power of the Geneva Conventions and their ability, when duly observed, to protect the safety, the dignity and well-being of those who are made most vulnerable in times of war and in times of conflict. And we call on all other states and all other parties to conflict to uphold these universally accepted laws. States and parties to conflict must lead by example, and ultimately respect for international humanitarian law is a question of political will, and we call on states to create a global culture of compliance with international humanitarian law. Now, Deputy Speaker, Australia is dedicated. It is dedicated to alleviating human suffering and protecting civilians in times of armed conflict through the application of this international humanitarian law. And we have been a strong supporter of the Geneva Conventions since we first signed them in 1950 and have ratified all 3 additional protocols. And in this divided world where conflict is rampant, it remains a powerful fact that every state has ratified these laws of war. Every state in the world has decided that limiting the human cost of war is their legal and their moral obligation. And we also acknowledge the many neutral and impartial humanitarian actors who continue to provide important and life-saving work for those impacted by the devastation of war. And we know, Deputy Speaker, that one of those is the International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement. And over the last 160 years, the International Red Cross has carried out its work in many international and armed conflicts, developing its activities as the needs arose, and monitoring the conditions of prisoners of war and other detainees and providing medical and humanitarian relief. Likewise, the National Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, like the Australian Red Cross, are there to promote and ensure respect for international humanitarian law, and they work with humanitarians to ensure they're prepared to operate in armed conflict, train corporations with a footprint in armed conflict, and support training for Australian Defence Force personnel and protect the Red Cross emblems, which does in fact save lives in times of conflict. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Swan.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today is a significant day, and I want to extend my gratitude to the member for Moreton for putting this important motion forward to recognise this day. Not only is today a milestone, but it's an opportunity for us to reflect on the importance of the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. 75 years ago today, the Geneva Conventions were signed and codified, and this was to establish the basic rights of wartime prisoners, civilians and military personnel. The first Genevan Convention began in 1864, and almost a century later, in the wake of immense civilian suffering, which we saw during World War II, 4 Genevan Conventions were universally accepted by the global community. This was a watershed moment that reflected our shared commitment to protecting human life during conflict. They incorporated the principles of neutrality, protection and care for the wounded, humane treatment of prisoners of wars, and the protection of civilians. The rules safeguarded civilians, medics, aid workers, wounded and sick and shipwrecked troops. The rules of war matter, and they do so today as they did 100 years ago, or 75 years ago. In 2024, as in 1949, human rights matter just as much as they do today. They are as relevant today as they were in 1949. Recent events around the world, be it Ukraine, Palestine or Bangladesh, show us why. I reflect today on the estimated 30,000 civilians who have lost their lives since the Russian invasion on Ukraine. Innocent civilians must not bear the cost for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In my electorate, like me, many people are deeply distressed by the suffering of innocent civilians in Gaza. I condemn the deaths of civilians after the devastating strike on Israel on the Al Tabeen school over the weekend. I also unequivocally condemn the attacks by Hamas on Israel on October 7, 2023. It is heartbreaking the number of civilians who have died in the Israel-Hamas conflict, including 39,000 Palestinians and 1,200 Israelis. Innocent civilians must not continue to bear the cost of the conflict in Gaza. All actors must comply with international humanitarian law. Australia has again called for an immediate ceasefire. We are united in this call and urgently demand by the need to protect civilians, to release hostages and to facilitate humanitarian aid. In Bangladesh, a country which I lived in for almost a year, I also have shared conflicts of constituents in my electorate about the conflict there. It is estimated that over 30 innocent children have been killed, and it's believed that hundreds of people were killed during the July protests. We are starting to see some positive movements in Bangladesh, but again, I will say that innocent children and innocent civilians must not bear the cost of conflict in Bangladesh. All these horrific events highlight the importance of recognising the significance of this anniversary and why it is relevant today. Let us use it to remind ourselves of the principles that underpin those treaties and the horrors that inspired their ratification. They are rules that were put in place to limit the horror repeating itself, and the universal ratification of each treaty demonstrates a global consensus to protect human life during armed conflict. At the core is the fundamental principles of humanity.
We can turn to the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights to understand these principles, which state, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Furthermore, every person is entitled to the same rights and freedoms, irrespective of race, colour, sex, language, religion, political or other opinions. These words hold deep meaning for me. And I remember in Year 6 at Campbell Primary School, my teacher, Mrs. Wilson, teaching us about Amnesty International and the rules of law and the need to protect humans. This is something that I hold true today, like I do every other day.
The time allotted for this debate has expired. There being no further speakers, the debate is adjourned. Oh, is that right? The debate is adjourned? Yeah. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting, and I call the clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 3, motion relating to cheaper childcare, moved by the member for Moncrieff.
May I call the member for Moncrieff?
I move the motion relating to cheaper childcare in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper.
Call the member.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, it's been over 2 years since the Albanese Labor government was elected, promising Australians that life would be cheaper under them. And yet, after 2 years of Labor, the cost of essentials has increased. Food is up by 11%, housing by 15%, rents are up by 15%, electricity up by 22%, and gas is up by a staggering 25%. Australians are paying 20% more personal income tax, despite the rhetoric you hear from the government. Household savings have collapsed by nearly 10 percentage points, and homeowners with a typical mortgage of $750,000 are nearly $35,000 worse off. It's quite jaw-dropping. Unfortunately, this is what happens when you vote for Labor. We know that Labor don't know how to manage money. They don't understand how inflation works, and they'll tell you whatever you want to hear just to win your vote. Over 12 months ago, Labor's cheaper childcare policy came into effect. Now, we warned Australians that Labor had not done the proper due diligence on this policy and that costs would rise. And what do you know? On July 1, 2023, centres increased their prices, then some increased again in January 2024, and then up they went again only just last month. In 12 months, out-of-pocket costs have increased by 8.4%, and families are right back where they started. And again, Labor will tell you that over 1 million families are better off under them. But they can't tell you how many parents and how many carers they supported back into full-time work. They promised 37,000. That was the number they promised you. And they can't tell you how much of the $4.7 billion spent was immediately eaten up by increased fees, never mind inflation. It appears the only thing they can tell you are the talking points, carefully crafted, of course, by the PM's media unit. And I mean, just last week, the announcement of a one-off 15% payment to early childhood educators is just further proof that this government cares more about winning votes than actually delivering good, long-lasting policy for the sector. In 2 years' time, when the wage payments have been made and fee restraints are removed, who, I ask you, Australians, who will be left footing this bill for those higher wages? It will be you. Australian families will be left with the bill. A 2-year pause on fee increases means that in the third year, prices will have to rise significantly, especially when most providers already increase their fees by more than the 4.4% cap that will be imposed. Even Good Start, the nation's largest not-for-profit, increased its fees by more than that just last month. And then, if we take a look at regional, rural and remote communities, the early childhood education situation is even more dire. There are families with no access at all, as the member for Casey will attest to. Families who drive an hour one way to do drop-off and then an hour back the other way just to go to work. Families who have to choose who goes to work and who looks after the children. Families who are struggling to get by because in this economy, both parents need to work to pay their bills. And every time those on the opposite side of the chamber open their mouths to talk about families and how they are better off under them, I want you to think about the families in regional Australia. Better yet, why don't you get out of your metro seats, those opposite, get out of the cities and go and visit them. like my colleagues and I have been doing. Go and listen to the parents in Lismore, still waiting for the services to be reopened or rebuilt. Go and speak to the parents in Casey in Victoria, where there's one early learning place for every 15 children. Yep. Or visit Grey in the great state of SA, the biggest childcare desert in the country. Because if you really cared about all families, you'd make sure a policy for access to early learning benefited all families. This government talks a big game, but they have no idea how to actually deliver it. The Coalition believes in choice and flexibility, that all families should have a choice, and right now, so many of you don't. We want to see actual cost of living relief delivered for families, something we know that this Labor government is actually incapable of delivering. All they have delivered to Australian families is higher inflation for longer. What all Australian families need is lower inflation, is lower mortgage rates, and is lower cost of living relief, and that this government is failing them on.
Is there a seconder for the motion?
Second the motion, reserve my right to speak.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Chisholm.
Thank you so much, Deputy Speaker. And I find it quite astonishing that we've just heard how dreadful it is we're making decisions that are going to reduce the cost of living on families, like bringing down childcare prices and giving workers a pay rise, while at the same time we're just listening to a list... Yes, thank you. A list of complaints rather than any substantial contribution. It just makes me really lament that in this place this is not a contest of ideas on this very important issue of cost of living and early childhood education. It's just an opportunity to politicise things that shouldn't be politicised, in my view, which is making sure that early childhood educators get a much-deserved pay rise and that families have lower costs to pay for childcare. That should be above politics, but yet again we're seeing from the opposition just really cheap attacks. Because we know that we saw this sector neglected for almost a decade, which meant that families had been struggling to access the early childhood education services they need. And we're working in contrast, to build a universal early childhood education and care system that's accessible, affordable and inclusive. And I think these are, aims that people in this place should support, no matter what political party they're from. We've already made some really good progress on this front, Deputy Speaker, with our cheaper childcare reforms making early learning more affordable for more than 1 million Australian families. And of course we know there's more to do, because you can't undo 10 years of damage overnight. We've received the final report from the Productivity Commission, helping us to chart the course to universal early learning that meets the needs of families across all of Australia. And I know in my own electorate, I undertook a survey on this very important issue and made a submission on behalf of my electorate to the Productivity Commission, as well as hosted roundtables with Minister Anna Lee. I know people in my electorate are very concerned about the state of early childhood education from those neglect that we've seen from those opposite, and really eager to be engaged in the next steps that our government are taking to improve the sector. We can't achieve our vision for accessible, affordable and inclusive early childhood education without a quality and sustainable workforce. We know that. That's why our government is funding a 15% wage increase for early childhood education and care workers. And I'm unapologetic about the fact that we're doing that. Those opposite might see it as a problem that we are giving a mostly female workforce a much-deserved pay rise for educating the youngest members of our community, but I simply will not back away from this being a very important commitment from our government. This overdue pay rise for workers in early childhood education will commence from December this year. And I want to acknowledge the many advocates who have been meeting with members of Parliament right across the country to convey the importance of this pay increase. And importantly, we're increasing the pay for workers in early childhood education and care while keeping costs for childcare and education low for families, reducing those costs. Measures in this year's budget have been building on what we've already delivered to date and are paving the way for, as I mentioned earlier, what will follow in response to the Productivity Commission's report. And again, I would hope that this is something that members in this House can get behind, because this is about the youngest people in our communities getting vital education in those first 5 years, which we know have lifelong benefits. And we know that through investing in early childhood education and care, yes, we're investing in children, but we're also investing in the productivity of the nation when more parents are able then to go into the workforce. And we know that this is something that primarily impacts women. And through increasing wages for early childhood educators, we're getting a triple benefit by making sure that those hardworking educators stay in this very, very important field of work. Deputy Speaker, I'm pretty sick of the negativity I'm hearing from those opposite. This is something where I would have hoped we could have had a vision for the future, for the children who are in education now, and the benefits that they will bring to the country when we invest properly in the first 5 years of their life. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Casey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, supply and demand, very basic economic concepts, clearly concepts that those opposite, including the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, don't understand. If you increase supply and demand stays the same, prices will come down. But over 2 years of this government, we have not seen one policy initiative to increase supply in early childcare sectors. All their initiatives have been aimed at reducing prices by providing wage subsidies, which in and of themselves understand that it has a role to play, but only if you increase supply. Because if there's only a fixed amount of places, guess what? Prices go up. Economics 101. And as a constituent in my electorate, Carly from Murrabak recently contacted me about this issue, and this is what she had to say, and I quote, "The cost of daycare is absurd. They've just announced they are increasing it again. My child goes 2 days per week and is now going from $149 per day to $159.50 per day, of which we are subsidised 50%. No change from Labor's supposed cheaper childcare." Another family in my community has gone from paying $162 per day to $175 per day after the increase in the subsidy last year. Another family has had a $13 a day increase from $129 to $142 a day. Deputy Speaker, I could sit here all day and use examples from my community or any community across the country of prices going up despite what the government promised. And the reason they can't deliver cheaper childcare is because they're not investing in supply. They're now going to subsidise wages, but they're not prepared to actually commit to a long-term plan. As the member for Moncrieff said, and I commend her for this motion, the government have committed to this for 2 years. 2 years, and then who's going to pay for it? The people that need the childcare. And they've also capped prices at 4.4% over the next 12 months. So they're capping the increases that our childcare centres can have at a time when the cost of food for the young children is going up. The energy at the centre is going up. The wages are obviously going up. If they've taken out a loan on that site, their interest rates are going up. So every cost is going up, and the government is saying 4.4% is all you can increase if you want to get access to this subsidy. They don't have any real plans to address the actual symptoms. It's all about treating the cause. It's band-aid solutions that make it worse. And childcare, it is an essential part of our life. We need to continue to invest in it. I was lucky to recently visit Hanson Park Preschool in my community. And I want to thank Amy and the Parents and Friends Committee there, but also the educators for the work they do. I was lucky enough, prior to politics, my wife Rachel was the president of our local preschool where my children went, and I've seen firsthand the amazing volunteers that put in so much for the community to make sure that children can get that early childhood education and support they need. But again, they're being let down by this government. They're being let down because there's no investment in supply. And the thing is, you can talk about price, and that is important, but it doesn't help those that cannot find a place. And in my community, we are definitely a childcare desert. There are currently 9 million Australians that are living in a childcare desert with little or no access to early learning education. And the member for Moncrief came to my electorate, and we met with Belinda and the team at Mums of the Hills. And we were talking to many of the parents who are having to put their children on wait lists as soon as they are born. They are having to pay a fee in many cases just to get onto a wait list. For every 15 parents that are trying to get into childcare, there is one place available in my community. And what we hear from the government about addressing these deserts in my community and many regional and peri-urban communities? Nothing. For 2 years, we have heard nothing from this government on how they are going to increase childcare places. It's very easy to talk about a subsidy, but it doesn't help if you can't get a place. And that's why, again, this government has the wrong priorities. They're not addressing the cause of these issues, they're addressing the symptoms. It's why after 2 years there's not one Australian that's better off.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call a member for Reid.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. My question to those opposite is, how do we increase the number of places at childcare centres? And this is something that we all want to be able to do. The only way you do that is to get a workforce in that can sustain increased spots, because we want to make sure that these kids are getting good quality education and that they have well-qualified early childhood educators looking after them. How long does it take to qualify to be an early childhood educator? You can do it TAFE course, diploma, a couple of years. So really, the hard work of trying to get more early childhood educators in the system needed to have happened a few years ago. So who was in government then? Those opposite. So when we talk about the lack of early childhood educators in the workforce, this isn't something that has sprung up in the last 1 or 2 years. This is something that has been problematic for many, many years, and we ought to have had the foresight to have trained these early childhood educators some years back so that they are now in the workforce. Last week, I visited Abbotsford Long Daycare Centre, and it's a really special early childhood education centre. You feel it as soon as you walk into the place. It's one of those places where the early childhood educators have been working there for years, sometimes decades. It's a not-for-profit organisation, a community-run centre that has been in Abbotsford for almost 40 years and has a strong reputation in the community. And parents play an active role in the running of the centre. And I met one of those parents. He spoke to me about how much his 3-year-old son had benefited from the rich learning environment Abbotsford Long Daycare Centre offered him. And I did a video with the centre director, Kylie Lawson, where we spoke about the importance of early childhood education, because early childhood education benefits the child, their families and our society. I know it, Deputy Speaker, you know it, the parents and educators at Abbotsford Long Daycare Centre know it. Unfortunately, those opposite failed to value this importance that early childhood education provided. They're complaining about the government providing help to families with childcare costs, and it begs the question, why? It's because they really don't want to look at their own record in this space. Over their 9 years in government, a period of historically low inflation across the global economy, across the globe, childcare prices under their watch skyrocketed. And it wasn't just the system that they neglected, they also neglected the workforce. They neglected those people who are doing the hard yards, looking after our kids. And it's them that we really need to support. During the May budget, there was a moment when the Treasurer was speaking that struck me. I looked up in the public gallery and I saw a row of women who were in tears. They were in tears
because of an announcement that the Treasurer had made, that we had put a provision in the budget to help fund an increase in the pay for early childhood educators. The next day, bright and early after the budget, I went to a post-budget breakfast that was run by the Community Childcare Association and Community Early Learning Australia. I got to meet those early educators. They were still emotional the day after the budget because many of them had been asking for years and years for their work to be valued. And in that budget speech, where we talked about ensuring that they got a pay rise, they finally felt as though they were being valued, that their work as educators, where they were providing a rich learning environment for our kids, was finally being recognised and valued, and they were finally going to be paid what they are worth. And that was what the announcement that the Prime Minister made yesterday was all about. It was about recognising the important contribution of these early childhood educators who had been fighting for so long to finally be valued. We said to them that we see the important work that you do, we value it, and we are going to pay you what you are worth.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And I thank the member for Moncrieff for her very important motion. The positive impact of quality early childhood education cannot be overstated. It is simply transformational. Kids who receive educational care earlier are better equipped for the challenges that life throws at them. It sets them up for success at home, at school and throughout their life. A resilient early childhood education sector is also a game changer for parents and carers, particularly in regional, rural and remote communities. When high-quality childcare is available, parents can choose to return to work sooner or work more days per week. And at a time when the cost of living is so high, access to childcare makes it easier to provide for a family. And if we get more parents working, we can help to address workforce shortages in areas such as teaching, healthcare, construction, so many others. Regional workforces are under so much pressure, and affordable and available childcare is one of the best tools we will have, ever to have, really, to fill the jobs we need. Unfortunately, though, this is not the reality across most of Australia. In rural and regional Australia, childcare deserts are everywhere, areas where there are 3 children for every childcare place. Just last week, new ABS data showed that a lack of childcare is the #1 reason stopping women from entering or re-entering the workforce. When families can't access childcare, women pay the price, losing out on career progression, superannuation accrual and social connection. It has consequences for the family budget and for the opportunities offered to that beautiful, developing child. This system is failing us. That's why, in mid-July, I hosted 2 Playdate events in my electorate with the Parenthood, one of Australia's leading advocacy groups for a better and fairer childcare system. And I want to thank Maddie Butler and the Parenthood for their commitment to regional childcare shortages and engagement with the people in my electorate of Indi. Our Playdate events were an opportunity to go beyond the statistics and hear from parents, grandparents and carers directly, to hear what childcare shortages mean for parents in my electorate and what they want to see done differently. I thank all the parents and carers who came out to the Wangaratta and Wodonga libraries and for those who wrote to me to share their stories. But what I'm hearing has me seriously concerned and reinforces exactly what the experts and the numbers are saying. I heard from parents who've lost track of the number of wait lists their child is on, forced to wait for years for a place to become available. I heard from parents driving hours every day to get their kids to where a spot is available, meaning only one parent can work full-time. I heard from grandparents who have given up work so they can step in to provide childcare because otherwise their own adult children would be in financial trouble. Frankly, something has to change. And while I commend the government for increasing the childcare subsidy, critical, and for its commitment to fund a wage rise for early childhood educators, so desperately deserved, more urgent action is required. We need to do more to train passionate and skilled early childhood educators. Recent research by the Australia Education Research Organisation shows that one of the greatest indicators of success in the first year of school is the quality of early childhood educators at that period. That is why it is so crucial, so fundamental that we support more Australians to build a career in this sector, and that we value and recognise the life-changing impact this work has. That means paying early childhood educators more, and I support the government's commitment to fund the 15% wage rise for employees. It means exploring all options to ensure more Australians study early childhood education and teaching in regional areas. This could involve expanding access to fee-free courses in regional centres and making sure that placements prepare, extend and develop the educators of the future. And finally, it could mean funding local governments and not-for-profits to provide childcare services in regional towns and communities where the for-profit sector won't fill the gap. This will require leadership by government, but if we're to create truly universal access to childhood education in regional Australia, it might be what is needed. I'm inspired by the work of organisations such as Thrive by Five, the Parenthood, the Mitchell Institute and the Centre for Policy Development, who are showing us that a better childcare system is possible. I'd also like to note the commitment of my state counterpart, Annabelle Cleland, the Nationals member for Euroa, for her ongoing engagement with me and addressing childcare shortages in North East Victoria. Universal childcare is a policy I support.
Expired. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Today we have a reason to celebrate because after so much advocacy, our early years educators have achieved a much-deserved pay rise. Backed in by the Albanese government, early childhood educators make it possible for millions of Australians to do their job and support young children's early learning and development. The role they play is so important, and our government recognises and values their contribution to families across the nation. And that's why I'm so proud that we will fund a 15% wage increase for early childhood education and care workers. This significant wage increase is an important next step in the government's reform to the sector. It will be phased in over 2 years and include a 10% increase from December 2024 and a further 5% increase from December 2025. This $3.6 billion investment from our government recognises the vital role that early childhood educators play in fostering better learning outcomes for children. And Deputy Speaker, in my electorate of Corangamite, early years educators and amazing United Workers Union advocate Rayleigh Fechner told my office this pay rise will be a game changer. She said, and I quote, "It's a good move. Some educators are working 2 or 3 jobs, and with this pay rise, they will have a much better work-life balance. It will encourage more educators to stay in the sector, and that's good for kids, because consistency in the classroom leads to better learning outcomes. And that's why this pay rise is so important, not just for workers, but for families." Deputy Speaker, I remember well back in 2018 catching the bus to Melbourne, surrounded by early years educators and standing with them as part of their Big Steps campaign, fighting for better pay and conditions. And I'm so proud that our government has listened and acted and is working closely with the sector to deliver better outcomes for these workers who for too long have failed to be recognised for the important and demanding work they do. And of course we understand there's more to do, and that's why we're working to build a universal early childhood education and care system that's accessible, affordable and inclusive. Deputy Speaker, for a sector facing worker shortages, this significant pay rise is meaningful progress. And to safeguard that progress and ensure we continue to grow the sector, our government is rolling out fee-free TAFE opportunities so that more young Australians can pursue a career as an early childhood educator. And on top of this, Deputy Speaker, it's now more than 1 year since our cheaper childcare laws came into effect. And while I know the member for Moncrieff who moved this motion cares about early years educators, I would like to remind her that our cheaper childcare policy has cut the cost of childcare for more than 1 million Australian families. If you're a family on a combined income of $120,000 and you have one child in care for 3 days a week, this has cut the cost of your childcare by about $2,000. That $2,000 in savings for almost 6,000 families is my electorate of Corangamite, Deputy Speaker, 6,000 families. Many of these families are now also receiving more pay in their pay packet with a tax cut of about $2,000. That's real cost of living relief. The biggest childcare provider in the country, Good Start, recently released a report that shows out-of-pocket costs have gone down, and those benefiting more from the cheaper childcare subsidies are families on low and middle incomes. The Albanese government recognises that they are doing it tough, and that's why addressing cost of living pressures is our #1 priority. Cheaper childcare not only puts money back into the pockets of families, it also enables parents, especially women, to decide whether to go back into the workforce if they wish, increase their hours and their pay packets. Deputy Speaker, under our government, every early childhood educator who pays tax will now get a tax cut as well as a pay rise. Working parents will also get a tax cut and access to the cheaper childcare subsidy. Deputy Speaker, the Albanese government is delivering tax cuts, pay rises and cheaper childcare so that Australians can earn more, keep more of what they earn, and early years educators can receive the respect they deserve. Thank you.
The time allotted for this debate has expired. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting, and I call the clerk.
Private members' business. Order of the day number 1, resumption of debate on a motion relating to affordable housing.
I call the member for Fraser.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak to this motion because affordable housing is one of the most important challenges that we face as a nation, and this government is taking action on a number of fronts to deal with this. This, as the motion alludes to, is an issue that has arisen over a long period of time, and it reflects actions taken at all 3 levels of government. It's that complexity and that structural nature of this issue which has made it so difficult to deal with. Now, I wanted to deal with the fact that this is not just a long-run problem, but it's a complex economic challenge because it involves both supply-side and demand-side dimensions. And it's only if you deal with both of those that we can make real progress with this issue. What are some of the supply-side issues? Well, obviously, Australia has not been constructing enough houses for a long time, and there are a number of aspects to this. One of the issues is local government planning issues. There's an inertia, there are undue constraints at the local government level. Now, federal governments have some limits on what they can do at that level, but I applaud the Treasurer and the Minister for Housing for having brought all 3 levels of government together, the federal government, state and territory governments and peak local government bodies, to deal with this in a coordinated way. I also applaud the fact that there was money in the last budget for last mile initiatives, which are often critical barriers to getting major approvals over the line. There are, in addition, workforce issues. This is an area where Australia has been facing increasing constraints, and it's also an area where the government has been taking considerable action over recent years. For example, over the first 2 budgets, or the first 3 budgets of the Albanese government, considerable extra money went into training additional people for the construction sector. That included an additional 15,000 fee-free TAFE and vet places just in the last budget alone, $62.4 million for that. Also, of course, considerable assistance for apprenticeships, where there had been a significant drop-off in the years preceding this government coming into office. And in the previous budget, there was $26.2 million for 5,000 places in pre-apprenticeship programs over the 2 years to 2025. And I've been seeing this in my own electorate. I was at an event on behalf of the Minister for Skills and Training at MEGT in my own electorate, where I was at a celebration of the 700,000th apprentice for that firm over its decades in operation. It was one example of many in my electorate of people obtaining qualifications, of young people starting out on careers where they will have so much to do over coming decades. But we need more, and it's great to see more and more people going into that pipeline. Of course, there's also the funding and finance side of the supply side, and this government has $32 billion worth of initiatives, including billions of dollars going into the community housing sector, including the HAF and including many, many other funding and financing arrangements. And that will do a considerable amount to support more housing. There's also, of course, the demand side. Now, the demand side, the supply side, in my opinion, should be the priority, and the supply side has been the priority of this government in its first 3 budgets. But I believe, in addition to that, targeted demand-side measures are appropriate in some circumstances. For example, I think Help to Buy measures are an appropriate way to help young people in particular overcome some of the generational barriers to obtaining a housing deposit. And the Help to Buy scheme that this government has put forward is a material measure that will help many thousands of people to get their first toe on that ladder of home ownership over the course of their lives. For so many people, they can service a loan, but they can't pull together the deposit. And so Help to Buy for me is a very important suite or element of the suite of policies that we need to consider. There are other measures, of course, like the $1 billion for women in particular fleeing family violence, giving them assistance in the short run for emergency housing options. That's a series of measures that provide material help, $5,000 for many, many people in that very, very vulnerable situation. So the member for McNamara has raised an extremely important issue. It's a multidimensional issue. It's an issue which has arisen over a long period of time, and it's not going to be solved overnight. It's going to require both supply-side and demand-side responses, and I've set out a few of the key ones. It's also going to require coordinated action across all 3 levels of government. So I commend the member for having raised this motion and the opportunity to highlight some of the government's actions in this area.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Cook. Sorry.
Second motion is reserved my right to speak.
Sorry, it's a continuation, resumption of debate. That's all good.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I commend the member for Fraser of his diagnosis of the problem. Very logical and couldn't agree more. That it is primarily a supply-side problem. We'd agree there are demand measures, and it does cut across the 3 levels of government. And we are in a housing crisis, though. Let's not make any bones about it. And governments across Australia are still not doing enough. The diagnosis of the problem is correct, but there is not enough action. Just this morning, I took a phone call from a local community member in Cook. His daughter and son-in-law and their kids can no longer afford to live in Cronulla. They're looking to move to Western Australia because they can't afford a house. They're school teachers. This man is losing his daughter, his son-in-law and their beautiful grandkids because, as a nation, we still cannot fix housing affordability. It's a national shame. Housing affordability is literally breaking up families. 3 weeks ago, I met with St Vincent's de Paul in Gymea, and it was an especially troubling case about a young woman, young single mother, facing homelessness. Homelessness in New South Wales this year alone is up 25%. Now, the Labor government is talking a lot about housing affordability, but prices keep going up and up and up. In early 2002, the median house price was 4.9 times median gross disposable household income. In 2024, this ratio has risen from 4.9 to 8.6 times. Treasury reports the amount of income needed to service a home loan has increased to 29% of your income to 46% of a household's income. So why are homes getting more and more expensive? Who's to blame? Government. It's a failure of government. Today in New South Wales, 50% of the cost of housing is government. That's the planning approval process. That's taxes and that's red tape. The government has failed to get housing supply to keep up with housing demand. On the demand side, record migration under this government. We have Australia's population is growing the fastest it has since 1952. A record 547,000 new migrants into the country last year, with only 164,000 new homes added. What happens when you get population growth dramatically outstripping housing supply?
skyrocketing house prices. But somehow this government does not understand this. Labor has largely ignored the problem. The government should be bringing in droves of immigrants in construction-related industries, but this Labor government has not. Instead, they've been prioritising yoga teachers and have been protecting unions, not importing new skilled workers in these industries. Furthermore, the Housing Australia Future Fund has not built any new houses in 2 years since they have been elected. 2 years, not a new single house in the middle of a housing crisis. It's unacceptable. This scheme has been poorly designed and it's turning into a case study on government killing the effectiveness of their own programs with too much red tape. So what is the solution? State and local governments control housing supply. They've been too slow to release land, too slow to approve development. And who can blame them? Because when they approve new developments, all they get is local roads becoming more congested. They get their hospital waiting rooms overcrowded. They get their local schools and their sports fields full of demountables. So what's the solution here? I'm calling for the federal government to fund state governments based on new home completions. We need more supply at lower prices. For every 1% of increase in the number of dwellings, house prices drop 2.5%. More supply helps renters too. A 1% increase in the vacancy rate provides rent cuts of up to 2%. So how do we get more supply? Well, the federal government needs to start funding the state governments for this. Start funding it with more infrastructure funding, GSD funding and rental assistance. Federal infrastructure funding should be allocated to states based on housing completions. If a state completes more homes, it should have more infrastructure funding. The GST formula could be reworked to provide states more funding for housing completions. And lastly, with rent assistance. The federal government could offer to cover rent assistance in exchange for states redeveloping their public housing. We should allow public housing tenants to buy their own homes and critical workers too. It's time to empower Australians and help them take control of their lives again.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Wills.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, this motion is a really important one, and I would hope that we can get out of the politicisation of it. Obviously, I want to acknowledge the member for McNamara for moving this motion on affordable housing, because it is a public policy area that is deeply personal to many of us, to me. Without access to public housing, I wouldn't be where I am today, and that's the truth. That journey from a houser to a renter to a homeowner also involved educational opportunities that flowed to migrants, my family and their children, and when governments got housing policy right, it made a real difference to our lives and our ability to make that contribution. And I'm keenly aware that it was easier to make that journey coming of age in the 1980s and 1990s than it is right now, for a whole host of reasons that we're debating and talking about. But it's why we have to get these critical policies right, why we have to put the politics aside and do the work necessary instead of grandstanding on it, because it matters to all of us. Access to good housing is a fundamental human right. It's a matter of basic dignity. We need a roof over our heads to be able to engage in our community, to fully participate at school or work, to look for and get a job, to contribute. And that, as I said, Deputy Speaker, gave my family, my sister and I, an opportunity to pursue our education and give back to the country that had given us so much. And that's a reality that I want for other Australians, for all Australians actually. And I know this is the reality that the Prime Minister and the Housing Minister, the new Housing Minister, Claire O'Neill, wants for all Australians. So housing affordability and rental stress, it's an issue that cuts very deeply across the country and causes stress to people in my community of Wills. It's for the young family trying to manage alongside childcare fees. It's for the university student juggling study with part-time work, for the older Australians relying on their pension or their super. We have far too many Australians experiencing or at risk of experiencing homelessness. In fact, single women over 55 are particularly vulnerable to homelessness. It is unacceptable that in a country endowed with such wealth and opportunity, that many of our fellow Australians have nowhere to call home or at risk of not having a home. I recently met with Dini Leonarachichi and Chris Sparks from Housing for the Aged Action Group, HAG, a Melbourne-based organisation that supports older Australians who are homeless or facing homelessness. They talked a lot about older women who are often forgotten, who fall through the cracks in conversations when we talk about vulnerable groups. They also raised elder abuse as not being spoken about as much when issues of family violence are raised as well. The group want interventions to focus on people who are at risk of homelessness before they end up actually sleeping rough. And I also recently hosted a youth housing roundtable with Minister O'Neill. I think it was her first in her new portfolio. We heard about all of the rental conditions, the poor rental conditions that people face, invasive rental application requirements, and stressful no grounds evictions. And a lot of the young people there described home ownership as being out of reach and that they needed to make compromises such as living at home with parents for longer or to save for a deposit or putting studies on hold to afford rent or a bond. These are stories reflected across Australia and they're unfortunately not new. And housing affordability is an issue that has been deepened by 10 years of inaction by the previous government, the coalition government, and it's an issue that we, in coming into power 2 years ago, are working every day to fix. It's something that is front and centre in our mind to work on affordability and supply because Australia doesn't have enough homes and we haven't for a while. Our priority is clear. Our objective is to build more homes for more Australians and we need to do this faster while also providing immediate support to Australians in need. And the government has an ambitious national target of building 1.2 million new homes by the end of the decade. We've added $6.2 billion in investment to build more homes. We've brought the total of new housing initiatives to $32 billion in just 2 years. We're supporting the build of new homes by growing our construction workforce to the point that was made by the previous speaker, by $1.5 billion to states and territories for housing infrastructure and works and more social housing. There are so many programs and policies that we've put in place in just a short time, and include that, of course, the $2.7 billion increase to Commonwealth rent assistance and $1.9 billion increase at the budget as well, doubling it twice there, and the build to rent scheme, which we've introduced to boost the build of more homes to ensure Australians can have access to safe and secure and affordable housing. This is money in the pockets, the $4.6 billion into the pockets of 1 million Australians who are feeling rental stress. But I will say this, Deputy Speaker, in conclusion. This is something that we are working on every day. It's not about the politics. This is about building more homes and addressing what the issue is: supply, supply, supply.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Griffith.
We're in the middle of the worst housing crisis that Australians have faced in generations. And right now we're debating a motion in Parliament that lists all the great things that the government has done, as if telling Australians you don't know how good you've got it. Well, for all the talk from this Labor government, literally the only things in this motion that are about new direct investment in public and community housing are elements that were won by the Greens in negotiations with Labor. Everything else is either recycling coalition-era agreements or making up misleading the public about what actually Labor's schemes will achieve. We have just seen today on Radio National the Housing Minister claim that there was Treasury modelling to demonstrate that the build-to-rent scheme would build 160,000 homes over the next 10 years. Except Treasury's officials in the last week have admitted that no modelling exists. Zero, nada, none. In fact, experts will say that Labor's scheme will give tax handouts to property developers and investors to build expensive apartments they already plan to build. Now, this would be a sick joke if it weren't so serious for millions of Australians right now who Labor refuse to help. For the millions of renters right now who are copping massive rent increases, many of them one rent increase away from eviction into homelessness. What they need is a freeze and cap on rent increases, not more words from Labor. For the first home buyers who repeatedly go to auctions and are beaten out by property investors who have tax handouts in their pockets from this Labor government, what they need is Labor to phase out those tax handouts to give first home buyers a chance, not more words from this Labor government. And they talk about people waiting for public housing or growing up in public housing. Well, build public housing then. Build public housing then. Australia is building less public housing now than it has at any point in its history since World War II. Since World War II. We have a proposal that the government can steal at any point. Establish a government-owned developer. Go and get it to build hundreds of thousands of good quality homes that are then sold and rented at prices people can actually afford. How Australia used to do it, how countries around the world do it. I mean, the bottom line is this. Over the next 10 years, this Labor government is going to give $165 billion in tax handouts to property investors to go to auctions and bid up the price of housing and screw over millions of renters trying to buy a home. Now imagine if that money went to building public housing instead. And how is it fair that there are people out there right now, pensioners who are skipping meals, single mums skipping meals so that their kids can afford to eat and they can cover their rent increase? How is it fair that they have to suffer while property investors get billions of dollars in tax handouts? And the bottom line is this: the Greens are ready and willing to work with the government. We're ready and willing to work with the government to develop a housing plan that actually starts to tackle the scale of this crisis. Last year, we secured $3 billion for funding in public and community housing. But what we will not accept is a Labor government, 75% of whom are themselves property investors, refusing to touch the tax handouts for property investors, refusing to invest any more in public housing, refusing to freeze and cap rent increases to give the millions of renters right now doing it tough a little bit of relief. And what's most galling about this, most frustrating, is Labor loves to pretend like they're doing all they can, as if this housing issue is, it's just so complicated and there's not much more we can do. Well, why is it then that countries around the world can do it? Why is it they can build enough housing, government-owned housing, and rent it and sell it at affordable prices? Why is it that they have higher rates of home ownership? Why is it that they pay much lower rents? Why is it that countries around the world, much less wealthy than ours, are able to do it? And why is it that in the 1980s and 70s, Australia was able to build enough public housing for people who need it, was able to build entire suburbs of good quality homes where workers were able to move into them and build good lives? Why is it that when Australia was a much less wealthy country with much less resources, much less sophisticated construction technologies and the ability to build homes at a faster rate, why is it that we were able to do it then but we can't do it now? The bottom line is right now that Labor are addicted to a neoliberal ideology that is about putting money in the pockets of banks and property investors and property developers and out of the pockets of ordinary renters and mortgage holders and people waiting to buy a home doing it tough. If you want a sign of how broken this housing crisis is, it is this. Last year, the Commonwealth Bank, as millions of mortgage holders were pushed into financial stress, the Commonwealth Bank recorded a record $10 billion profit. A record $10 billion profit. So while the government is sitting and overseeing a housing system that makes record profits for banks, profits for developers, the rest of us get screwed.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Bennelong.
Deputy Speaker, the truth is Australia has not had enough homes to meet the needs of its people for a very long time. This is not a problem that has emerged overnight or post-pandemic. It's a crisis decades in the making. We are here not because of migration, as the Liberals would want you to believe, but we're here because of poor governments, poor planning, underinvestment, and an indifference to housing in general by all levels of government for a long time. And because of it, rents are up and they continue to rise. Buying a home is hard and becoming harder. And it's hurting people and it's hurting our economy. Deputy Speaker, on housing, I really fear for our state in New South Wales and our nation. I fear for our young, who have grown up with parents who could afford a home on a modest wage, but who themselves cannot, often earning higher wages. This inequity of this reality is becoming increasingly unpalatable. In New South Wales, half of our young people are leaving the state. People cannot afford to live in Sydney or the regions, and they're going elsewhere. The Premier State cannot continue to be great without our best and brightest in it. And in my electorate of Bennelong, I want to do everything I can to make young people welcome by making housing more affordable. I want Bennelong to be a vibrant hub for young people to study at our 2 local TAFEs and at Macquarie University. Then I want graduates to work in the Health and Tech and Innovation Precinct in Macquarie Park or establish a business in one of our vibrant town centres. And I want them to do all that whilst living locally, in student, affordable, social, build-to-rent and market housing that is accessible. To do this in Bennelong and across the country, every level of government needs to align. In my 10 years on Ryde Council, 19,000 new dwellings were approved. 13,000 of those were in the 5 years that I was Mayor. And Deputy Speaker, I copped a lot of flack for that, and I danced a fine line between heritage, low density, and more affordable high density. But at the end of the day, I took the approach that building more housing was the right thing to do for young people. And even with that record, we were held back by a state government that didn't allow for more affordable housing, and we had a federal government that simply just did not care. And that's what makes me proud to be part of this government, Deputy Speaker. We care. We care about delivering more homes. And we're not just yelling from the sidelines, as you just heard there from the Greens, and we're not blocking progress, as the Liberals do. We're actually getting involved in the delivery of more housing across the country. Our $32 billion Homes for Australia package is historic. And despite the political and economic headwinds we face, it is delivering. By directly investing in the construction of new homes, by directly investing in growing our workforce, we will deliver more homes, which will help with affordability. Our $10 billion Housing Australia Future Fund will support the construction of 30,000 new social and affordable rental homes over the next 5 years. Importantly, in the short term, it will turn market housing into non-market housing and will get more approved dwellings off paper and out of the ground. However, we also recognise that while we work towards these long-term goals, there are immediate needs that need to be addressed. And that's why we've raised Commonwealth rent assistance not once, but twice. That's why we're working with state governments to invest directly into public housing, reform renters' rights, and land significant planning reform. Deputy Speaker, there is so much more to be done. This problem is so acute that we are in a national crisis. And usually, in a crisis, this parliament usually works together. But on housing, we're not seeing that. What voters must know is that we have bad faith actors in this parliament who are putting short-term politics over building more homes. Two significant measures are being held up by an unholy alliance between the Greens and the Liberals. Together, they're stopping Australians getting government help to buy their first home, and they're stopping 160,000 rental homes being built by blocking tax reforms to incentivise their construction. I say to the Greens and to the Liberals that you cannot fix a housing crisis without building more homes. This has been decades in the making, and it cannot be fixed overnight. We went to the election promising to help with the housing crisis, and in 2 years we've made so much progress, but I fully acknowledge there's much, much more to do.
Question is that motion be agreed to. I call the member for Hughes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This motion concerns affordable housing. It makes reference to government spending of $32 billion purportedly on housing. And there is one thing, I was in the chamber when I heard my friend, the member for Bennelong, talking about the fact that the current housing crisis has been due to poor government, and it's certainly something that I do agree with the member for Bennelong about. Because, Deputy Speaker, after 2 years of Labor and now a second Minister for Housing, housing affordability does indeed remain a national crisis in our country. This is a crisis that the federal government can fix and has failed to fix. Whether it be home ownership or rent, social, emergency housing, the failure by government to address supply shortages and instead spend more money on establishing funds and schemes. Labor governments always love establishing a fund, love a scheme. None of these funds or schemes are going to build any more houses. And the Prime Minister himself has had to admit to this failure on his housing policy by now introducing a new minister to try and fix this problem. Because, to recap, Deputy Speaker, in March 2022, Anthony Albanese went to the Australian people and said, under this government, you will have cheaper mortgages and cheaper rents. What has happened since the May election? Average Australian households, those in my electorate of Hughes, have now paid more than $45,000 since his government was elected, and that is absolutely due to the 12 successive interest rate rises in a row that we have had under this government. And the interest rate rises, the Reserve Bank Governor last week said the inflation is remaining high and interest rates will need to remain higher for longer as a result of federal government and state government Labor overspending. It's spending in the wrong place. The former housing minister announced $10 billion for housing. What did this $10 $10 billion amount to, Deputy Speaker? It was the establishing the Housing Australia Future Fund. But this has proven to be nothing but a $30 million spend on consultants and executives associated with that fund. It's proven to be jobs for Labor mates, both directly and indirectly. Wayne Swan is involved with the HAF in his dual role as both Labor Party president and also head of the CBUS Fund. CBUS, which has its own government issues. The board of CBUS, for example, has CFMEU directors on board. The CFMEU is massively contributing to inflating the housing costs. There's a 30% premium on all construction sites controlled by the CFMEU. But the government then wants to use CBUS funds to help with the housing fund. There should be no role for either the CBUS or the CFMEU in any of the government housing schemes. The new Minister for Housing has just re-announced the 1.2 million new homes for Australians. That's 240,000 homes that have to be built every year over 5 years. Back 8 years ago, we were building 240,000 homes per year. Now we'll be lucky this year to build 150,000 homes. And this government has failed on a very important factor going into housing affordability, which is to allow Australians the opportunity to use their superannuation, their own money, to invest in a home. And, Deputy Speaker, I just want to read to you a letter I've received recently from one of my constituents, Lynn from Engadine. She points out that her youngest daughter, also a Jenny, aged 51, has 3 children in their 20s. She's working full-time, a reasonably well-paid job. She has a husband who is retired. They're paying over $1,200 per week rent. She said, "My daughter has never been able to own a property." She has a good amount of super though, but she's unable to be able to save any more for the deposit because of the huge amounts that she's paying in rent. However, if she could access her superannuation, she could now be into a home. So what I say, Deputy Speaker, to Lynn and her daughter and Lynn's grandchildren is that this coalition government, if in government, we will allow people to access their superannuation, which is their own money. We will allow Australians to have a choice as to whether or not they keep their money in superannuation or whether they use it to purchase a home. This will allow first home buyers into the market, and it will also allow women who are coming out of a divorce or need to start their life again. It will allow women, older women, the opportunity to also purchase their own home. This is a housing affordability crisis, Deputy Speaker. It's a housing affordability crisis that this government has failed to address.
The time allotted for this debate has expired and the debate is adjourned, and the resumption of the debate will be made in order of the day for the next sitting. I call the clerk.
Private members' business, notice number 4, motion relating to the invasion of Ukraine.
I call the member for Fisher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I move the motion relating to the invasion of Ukraine in the terms in which it appears on the notice paper. Madam Deputy Speaker, Australia risks again falling behind like-minded partners supporting Ukraine unless the Albanese government moves to quickly back the G7 agreement to a $50 billion loan for Ukraine obtained through frozen Russian assets. Having claimed legal difficulties as justification to not use Russian assets, the Albanese government now needs to stop finding excuses to not support Ukraine and wholeheartedly commit to doing all that Australia possibly can. If Australia's laws need changing to better target Russian assets or make more effective sanctions on Russia, then all Labor needs to do is act, because the Coalition is clear in our support. The Coalition, since the beginning of Russia's abhorrent and illegal invasion of Ukraine, has offered full bipartisan support to the Labor government to implement all possible mechanisms that would aid Ukraine's self-defence. Instead of acting wherever it can, Labor has let Australia's relative support decline, including by junking military helicopters, by making some cockamamie argument that they can't provide Hawkeye vehicles because the anti-lock braking system isn't quite up to scratch, by ignoring hot calls to reinstate Australia's embassy in Kiev and turning down requests for coal. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine led to approximately 300 billion in Russian central bank foreign currency reserves being frozen in G7 countries. $300 billion. Over the past 2 years, multiple analyses have been published demonstrating that a transfer of Russian assets to Ukraine would vindicate respect for international law and alleviate the burdens on Ukrainian and West Australian and Western taxpayers because of Russian aggression. Unlike the UK and Canada, Australia has not yet weighed in on the unfolding global debate as to the transfer of Russia's frozen assets to Ukraine. Australia's contribution to this debate is well overdue. The Coalition has said that when Labor fails to act, we will explore Senate inquiries or other mechanisms to put pressure on the Albanese government to do so. On the 27th of March 2024, the Coalition was successful in referring the issue of Australian support for Ukraine to a Senate inquiry. This committee has been examining Australian support for Ukraine with a focus on whether Australian support is sufficient, timely and coordinated in a manner that optimises opportunities, drawing on government, industry and allied initiatives, and is due to report back on the 16th of September 2024. The Coalition will also be examining the mechanisms to freeze and confiscate assets belonging to sanctioned persons, entities, and how the proceeds can be used to benefit peoples and countries impacted by the behaviour of sanctioned individuals and entities as part of a broader Senate inquiry into Australia's sanctions regime. It's not just the Coalition raising these concerns, as reported in The Australian on the 9th of April 2024. An eminent group of former politicians, academics, ambassadors and doctors wants the federal government to redirect $9 billion of frozen Russian assets to help rebuild Ukraine. While Australia might not contain the largest pool of assets, we should at least be contributing to the debate. The United States is leading the global initiative for the payment of reparations to Ukraine via the transfer of forfeited Russian assets, though it controls only a minority of frozen Russian assets. Other than the US, Canada is the only other G7 nation that presently has a legal regime authorising the transfer of Russian sovereign assets to Ukraine. As mentioned before, the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee has been examining Australian support for Ukraine with a focus on whether Australian support is sufficient, timely and coordinated in a manner that optimises opportunities, drawing on government, industry and allied initiatives. The Coalition continues to stand with Ukraine. We honour the bravery and strength of the people of Ukraine, who continue to courageously defend their sovereignty, their freedom and their homes. We share their sadness at lives lost as they resist Russian forces, especially the innocent women and children who suffer from Russia's indiscriminate attacks. The government has refused to provide most of the military capabilities Ukraine have been publicly campaigning for, including tanks, Hawkeyes and Taipan helicopters. We urge the government to reopen the Australian Embassy in Kiev as a strong show of support for Ukraine and base Australia's incoming ambassador for Ukraine in Kiev. Slava Ukraine.
Is the motion seconded?
Second the motion and reserve my right to speak.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Solomon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Our government is unwavering in its support of the people of Ukraine in the face of Russia's unprovoked and unjustifiable war. Australia continues to stand with Ukraine as we work with our partners to support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I was glad to be able to pass that message on directly to members of Ukraine's government and armed forces when Senator Fawcett and myself represented the Australian Parliament in Copenhagen at the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Last year I also had the honour of visiting the 5th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment, which are from my electorate, Darwin. Visited them in the United Kingdom and spent time with them as part of Operation Kudu. They were training members of the Ukraine Defence Force. Operation Kudu is the Australian Defence Force's commitment to that training of those Ukraine recruits, working alongside partner nations as part of the UK's training program, UK-led training program to build additional capacity for Ukraine to defend their homeland, focusing on basic infantry tactics, which we observed in urban and in wooded environments, such as the environments in which they find themselves facing the invading Russians. Building on our reputation as a highly regarded partner, Australia will now also build on Operation Kudu by joining NATO's new security and training initiative for Ukraine as an operational partner. In addition, under Operational Kudu, a Royal Australian Air Force Wedgetail aircraft was deployed to Germany in support of multinational efforts helping protect a vital gateway of international humanitarian and military assistance to Ukraine. Up to 100 ADF personnel are deployed with the Wedgetail. Australia was honoured to provide this aircraft to help protect the vital lifeline of humanitarian aid and military assistance entering Ukraine. And these are just some examples of our government's approach to the crisis in Ukraine. The approach has been substantial, ongoing and bipartisan largely. The government's meaningful support totals over $1.3 billion to date. $1.1 billion of that has been in military assistance. Australia continues to be the largest non-NATO military contributor to Ukraine. And since we came to office 2 years ago, we have more than doubled the military contribution to Ukraine, making us that largest non-NATO contributor of military assistance. Recently, last month, we announced Australia's single largest military assistance package worth around $250 million. The package includes air defence missiles, air-to-ground weapons, including guided weapons, anti-tank weapons, artillery, mortar, cannon and small arms ammunition, and a shipment of boots. These contributions ensure the men and women of Ukraine's armed forces can continue their vital efforts on the front line. During his visit to Washington last week, the DPM also joined other partners in signing a memorandum of understanding on the Drone Capability Coalition. This follows our government's $30 million commitment to provide drones to Ukraine as part of this important coalition. We have also provided demining equipment, portable X-ray machines, a 3D metal printer and counter-drone systems, which are some of the Australian developed equipment that will contribute to the defence of Ukraine. I'm very proud that this assistance from Australia included 3D metal printers made by a local Darwin company that's based at Charles Darwin University, Speed 3D. These contributions provide Ukraine with some of the best capabilities in the world, while investing in Australia's sovereign defence industry and tech sector. This latest support takes Australia's overall assistance to Ukraine to approximately $910 million, including the provision of Bushmaster protected mobility vehicles, heavy artillery, critical ammunition, and contributions to the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund. In June, a few months ago, we announced $31 million in energy and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Overall, our government remains committed and will do more.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Casey.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Well, firstly, to my good friend, the member for Solomon, my co-chair of the Parliamentary Friends of AUKUS, I do and genuinely want to congratulate him on his new role as the Special Envoy for Defence, Veteran Affairs and Northern Australia. Congratulations to him. It's been nice to work closely with him on the Parliamentary Friends of AUKUS, and in his new role, I hope he continues not just AUKUS but also Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, because the Coalition does stand in support with the government when it comes to better targeting Russian assets and more effective sanctions on Russia. We have always said from the start of this invasion that we offer full bipartisan support to the Labor government to implement all possible mechanisms that would aid Ukraine's self-defence. So I congratulate the member for Solomon and look forward to continuing to work with him on AUKUS, but also ensuring that we support the Ukrainian people, because the abhorrent, illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine by Russia has tested us as a Western democracy. It has tested the global response, and so far we have stood up, led obviously by the Ukrainian people. But there is more that we need to continue to do. We are seeing across the world a global struggle for freedom and democracy as authoritarian regimes are flexing their muscles, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Iran, we're seeing these challenges. And I'm very lucky in Casey to have a strong Iranian diaspora who have been devastated to see the many political death penalty murders of many that have fought for freedom in Iran. And just last week, Reza Razi, a young man, was executed for standing up for his political beliefs. Now, the member for Menzies and I both sponsored Reza as a political sponsor to do what we could to ensure his freedom, but unfortunately he was executed last week. And the women life freedom movement that was established in Iran after the abhorrent killing of Mahsa Amini has not stopped. There are many in Iran that have continued to agitate and work under the radar for freedom and for democracy in that country. There are many in Australia, in the Iranian community, that have supported them, that have risked their own lives, have risked the freedom of those of their family back at home, that are continuing to protest, are continuing to work every day to ensure democracy and freedom comes to the Iranian people. And we need to continue to stand with them and support them at this tough time. I was proud to be signing as a political sponsor. I'll continue to stand with the Iranian community in Australia as they fight for their democracy and for their freedom. Because that is what we're seeing across the globe, this struggle. And in many cases, the Ukrainian people are on the front line of that challenge, of that battle of ideologies and of beliefs. And we as a parliament, the Australian government and the opposition need to do everything we can to support them. And there are many different ways that Australia as a country is helping, through official channels, but also through private business. And one organisation that's received coverage and is doing a great job is a Melbourne company out of Port Melbourne called SIPAC. And they have developed cheap and efficient cardboard drones that are being utilised by the Ukrainians to ensure that they can keep the Ukrainian people safe, but also they can start to turn back the invasion of their people. And there's many ways that we can continue to support organisations like SIPAC. It was wonderful to see about 2 weeks ago that they received funding and were successful in a process with the Department of Defence to continue to ramp up their drone production for Australia's use, but also for use in Ukraine, because that is what we have seen in this battle between Ukraine and Russia, a changing in warfare to a drone-based system that has really fundamentally changed how we go about these battles. And the implications are profound for many in the community, particularly as we look at artificial intelligence and how we control these drones and target different areas of opponents and enemies while keeping civilians safe.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for McEwen.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to talk on this motion about Ukraine. Because what's important when we talk about this is we talk about the Australian government's commitment and support that has been steadfast and reliable for the people of Ukraine. Ukraine's strength in the face of this illegal invasion is a testament to that nation's endurance, and that's why we have been steadfast in our continued support. Such an egregious breach of sovereignty unites Australians behind the efforts to support our allies. We marvel at their endurance and their spirit as they fight for their culture, democracy and livelihoods, which is why the Albanese Labor government has continued to provide support through our words, our sanction and, most importantly, financial aid to Ukraine. Our support for the Ukrainian government should be above politics, but it's not. The member who proposed this motion has been fairly consistently engaged with the issue of Russian invasion to Ukraine, and I'll give him that. But while we get these cheap words, the lack of acknowledgement of what the Australian government has done and continues to do so is outstanding. This shouldn't be a political football. something for the opposition to kick about whenever they want to crank up their rhetoric. And all of this, especially when their own party is infiltrated with pro-Russian supporters. It is hypocrisy, but at this point, it's to be expected. We shouldn't expect much more when you have people like Senator Antic, top of the Senate ticket for South Australia, their #1 choice to be in this place, parading on the Senate floor saying, and I quote, "the little fella from Ukraine, whatever his name is." That's an appalling statement to make. An appalling, but then you'd think, all right, made of blue, maybe move on, but no. Following that, when corrected, when mentioned about it, he said, anyway, who cares? That is the #1 person that Peter Dutton, the member for Dixon, the opposition leader, wants in the Senate. That is what they're saying about the President of Ukraine. And then to come in with a motion like this is just utter hypocrisy. They accuse the government of not doing enough when we have continually reaffirmed Australia's commitment to Ukraine. In case you missed it, we have recently provided Australia's largest single military assistance package worth over just under $250 million. This recent package communicated to Ukraine's President Zelensky, alongside the Indo-Pacific 4 partners at the recent NATO summit in Washington, reflects our ongoing commitment. It puts us on par with many of our allies, not only with our region, but amongst our European friends. This assistance reflects the national resolve as an ally and a friend to repel this illegal invasion. As part of our package, military package includes defence missiles, air-to-ground weapons, including guided weapons, anti-tank weapons, artillery, mortar, cannon, small arms ammunition, even shipments of boots, ensuring that the men and women of Ukraine's armed forces can continue their efforts on the front line. Since the conflict started, Australia has imposed more than 1,200 sanctions in response to Russia's full-scale invasion. These sanctions have reflected the Australian government's position that those supporting Russia's illegal war will face consequences. As the Deputy Prime Minister, the Defence Minister had said, and I put it, we stand with Ukraine in support for its courageous people and also in the defence of the fundamental principle, the right of every sovereign nation to be secure in its own borders and to determine its own future. These actions not only align with this government's consistent foreign policy and stance on global issues, but also reflected in the views of Australians. Just recently, the Lowy Institute put out polling that shows that as of 2024, 62% of Australians strongly support keeping strict sanctions on Russia, and an additional 24% indicating they are supportive of it. The Australian people are with us on that. The international community are with us on that. The only people complaining are the opposition. We'll continue our commitment to protect innocent civilians in Ukraine. But the next time you see the opposition come into this chamber and accuse the government of not doing enough for Ukraine, it'd be great if their backbenchers could come in here and denounce Senator Antic's words. Denounce the view that he put forward. I've had the honour of being able to listen to, along with the member for Fisher, to the Prime Minister Zelensky at the United Nations last year. To hear a man who was genuinely fighting for his people, you'd think that this parliament would support that, and I look forward to the Liberals actually getting up and saying Antic is wrong and support Ukraine, Slava Ukraini.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Braddon.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, it's been 2.5 years since Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. During that time, the Coalition's support for Ukraine has remained absolutely unwavering. As a nation, we must continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine and its people, to honour their bravery and to grieve the losses and the unspeakable injuries inflicted at the hands of Russia's abhorrent actions. We must continue to recognise the strength of a people who, against all odds, have courageously defended their sovereignty, their territorial integrity, their freedom and their homes. Importantly, we must never, never forget that Ukraine's war is our war. It's Australia's war. Although fought on Ukrainian soil, Ukrainians are fighting in Australia's national interest, in the interests of all like-minded countries across the world. This is a war, Deputy Speaker, between democracy and autocracy, That's why Ukraine must prevail. The geopolitical importance of the Ukrainian independence for the security of Europe cannot be underestimated. A Russian victory would not only sacrifice Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but would also threaten the stability of Europe itself. The Russian leadership would be revitalised. They would be in control of Ukraine's vast human and material resources, and they would loom large on the eastern border of our NATO alliance. Closer to home, Russia's aggression has already had a significant impact on Indo-Pacific security dynamics. If Russia was to be victorious, it would not only embolden like-minded nations right across the globe to act right across the Indo-Pacific, across Australia's doorstep. In May and June of this year, Russia's President Putin visited China, North Korea, Vietnam, and his aim was to shore up key strategic partnerships between these countries and their leaders. Australia must remain resolved and play our part in defending the peace in our region. Token words are not enough. It's beholden of the government of the day, the Albanese government, to support the Ukrainian war effort with practical assistance. Within 2 months of Russia's invasion, the former coalition government delivered a comprehensive $285 million package of support to Ukraine. This included military and humanitarian assistance, visas for Ukrainians seeking shelter in Australia, and more than 79,000 tonnes of thermal coal. We also applied more than 800 sanctions on Russian individuals, entities and their supporters. Today, we continue to offer our bipartisan support to this government. However, leadership from the highest level of this government is lacking, as far as I'm concerned. It's a responsibility of the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister to stop dragging their feet and to stop finding excuses to act. It's not good enough that Ukrainian officials had to plead for 6 months before the Albanese government finally sent shipments of thermal coal. Coal that was desperately needed to meet the nation's energy needs as Russia targets its power plants with precision-guided missiles and drone attacks. In contrast, the coalition government was the largest contributor of coal to Ukraine of any non-NATO country. On this side, we stand ready to provide full bipartisan support to the government to implement all sensible mechanisms that would aid Ukraine's self-defence. Australia must remain steadfast in its commitment to the Ukraine, to reconfirm that we stand with like-minded countries, like-minded nations, and fight for the rule of law and fight for national sovereignty. These are the global principles that Ukraine are fighting for on behalf of every single Australian, every single day. Principles that underpin peace and prosperity in our region and right across the world. Deputy Speaker, token words aren't enough. It's beholden to this government, the Albanese government, not to fall behind like-minded partners. Labor must act quickly, and as the old saying goes, so we pacem para bellum, which means if we desire peace, then we must be prepared for war.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Slava Ukraini. Australians have followed news reports from Ukraine with horror and sadness since the brutal Russian invasion. According to the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, at the 2-year mark, this senseless war had claimed the lives of over 10,000 civilians and injured nearly 20,000. The same report also indicates that the actual numbers are most likely significantly higher. And of course, these figures do not illustrate the effect of the mass displacement of civilians, the loss of livelihoods, and the collective trauma suffered by the Ukrainian nation. It's even more difficult to gauge the loss of life and casualties of military personnel, as Ukraine does not release these figures. Estimates range from 30,000 to 70,000 deaths. Russian deaths and casualties, both civilian and military, are similarly challenging to estimate, let alone verify, but are undoubtedly higher because of the Russian military tactics. These tragic figures are the backdrop to the daily news reports that we see, featuring terms like counter-offensive, blockade, occupied territory, bombardment, incursion, civilian exodus and missile strike. Without even knowing the specifics, these words paint a picture of horror, destruction, death an emergency humanitarian need. And it's why the Albanese Labor government has been steadfast in the support of Ukraine since coming to office. Both the Prime Minister and the Minister for Defence have made visits there, confirming that our support remains resolute. A despot's military takeover should never be tolerated. It only emboldens and begets more brutality and horror. Australian support is more than symbolic under both Labor and the LNP before. It's bipartisan, it's concrete, it's effective and it's ongoing. This support has totalled over $1.3 billion to date. $1.1 billion of this has been in military assistance. Since coming to office, Labor has more than doubled our military contribution. Most recently, in July, the Minister for Defence announced a military package worth around $250 million. The package includes air defence missiles, air-to-ground weapons, including guided weapons, anti-tank weapons and ammunition. This announcement also included Australia's decision to join NATO's new security and training initiative as an operational partner. This measure indicates our commitment to supporting Ukraine. ADF personnel have trained over 1,450 Ukrainian Armed Forces personnel in the UK on infantry tactics for urban and wooded environments. I recently met the crew of the RAF E-71 Wedgetail, deployed to the region for 6 months to secure a crucial gateway for international humanitarian and military assistance to Ukraine. I met them out at the Canberra airport. Over the course of the war, Australia has provided 120 Bushmaster protected mobility vehicles, 56 armoured vehicles, 6 howitzers, trailers and special operations vehicles, ammunition and anti-armour weapons, body armour, personal combat equipment and clothing and counter-drone systems. We've also supplied humanitarian assistance with a $31 million energy and humanitarian aid package. $20 million is being directed to the Ukraine Energy Support Fund, which provides electricity and heat for civilians, enables repairs to the energy grid. This amount may be directed towards buying coal with the added benefit of no shipping and insurance costs. The government maintains close contact with the Ukrainian embassy to ensure that our contributions are effective. We're confident in this approach, with Ukraine stating, and I quote, "Australia's aid has a multiplier effect. It not only directly meets needs, but it also affirms and strengthens Ukrainians in their pursuit of our common values and withstanding Russia's illegal invasion." Australia has provided $10 million to the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. This will be directed towards improving access to clean water and food and shelter for the thousands of displaced people. And we've committed $1 million to the United Nations Partnership on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which includes people needing assistance after sustaining war injuries. Another important measure is the imposition of sanctions. Over 1,200 targeted financial sanctions and trade measures have been imposed by the Albanese government against Russia since February 22. Most recently, we've targeted 6 entities involved with North Korea's supply of arms to Russia. Cumulatively, these sanctions work to decrease Russia's ability to both fund and conduct its unjustifiable and immoral war. Deputy Speaker, Australia proudly stands as the largest non-NATO contributor of military assistance to Ukraine. We'll continue to stand by the Ukrainian government and its people in their fight for their sovereignty in the face of Russia's ongoing barbaric and unjustifiable war for as long as it takes. Slava Ukraini.
Thank the member for Moreton. Time allotted for this debate has now expired. The debate is adjourned and the resumption of debate will be made an order of the day for the next sitting, and the Federation Chamber now suspends until 4 p.m.